56 years ago, a toddler vanished right in front of his own home in Georgia, disappearing without a trace and leaving his family completely devastated in pain and despair. Authorities suspected a strange woman who had appeared near the yard was involved, but no body was found, and there were almost no reliable leads to pursue, causing the investigation to quickly stall. However, throughout all those years, a resilient mother never gave up hope, clinging to the slim chance that her son was still alive somewhere. Then one day, while reviewing old documents that seemed utterly useless, investigators discovered a crucial detail that everyone had overlooked, a detail powerful enough to turn the entire case around and shock everyone involved in ways no one could have imagined. Before diving into this shocking story, let us know where you're watching from, and if you like this video, don't forget to subscribe to support the channel. The fall of 1970 in Columbus, Georgia, was a time when most residents still believed that quiet suburban neighborhoods could shield them from any misfortune. Life moved slowly, neighbors had known each other for generations, and children played in front yards without close adult supervision. The Wright family lived in a single-story wooden house on the edge of the city, near a strip of low trees leading out to County Line Road. Michael Wright worked at a machine shop near Fort Benning, usually getting home in the late afternoon, while Eleanor Wright stayed home to care for their child. Their one-year-old son, Samuel, was an active but clingy boy who often played in the playpen set up right in the backyard, where Eleanor could keep an eye on him while doing chores. That afternoon unfolded like any other. Pale sunlight filtered through the tree canopy. The neighborhood was quiet, with only the sound of a radio drifting from a neighbor's house and a light breeze across the lawn. The first anomaly appeared when a strange woman walked past the front of the Wright house. She paused for a few seconds, her eyes directed toward the backyard, then continued walking slowly. No one in the area recognized her, and her presence stood out from the usual routine of the neighborhood, which typically involved only familiar faces. A short while later, a light blue sedan drove slowly down the back road, stopping at a distance close enough to observe, but not long enough to draw strong attention. Eleanor caught a glimpse of it from afar but didn't think it was a sign of danger, since unfamiliar cars occasionally wandered into the area, looking for the route to Alabama. Samuel was still playing in the playpen at that time, tapping on his wooden toy car, and occasionally looking toward his mother. Eleanor continued folding laundry, then stepped inside the house for a few minutes to check on a pot of water boiling in the kitchen. She didn't leave the yard for long, just enough time to turn off the stove and grab a towel. When she returned outside, the backyard suddenly felt unusually empty. The playpen was still in its original position, but Samuel was no longer inside. The toy car lay tilted on the grass, its wheels touching the ground at an angle that hadn't been there before. Eleanor instinctively called her son's name, scanning the yard, looking down the side path, then rushing to the front door to see if Samuel had crawled out on his own. There was no response, no crying, no movement other than the wind rustling through the bushes. Realizing something was wrong, she ran to the neighbor's house and called for help. Within minutes, 4 or 5 people from the surrounding area came out to search. They checked every bush, every open patch of ground, every slightly ajar garage corner nearby. One group ran to the back road where the blue car had been spotted. Another walked along the grass corridor leading to an empty lot a few houses away from the Wrights. No one found any trace of Samuel, no abandoned items, no small footprints, no sound suggesting the child's location. The neighborhood's silence grew heavy, no longer carrying its familiar peaceful feel, but turning into a sense of alarm. Eleanor began to panic, repeatedly calling her son's name while Michael was informed at work and was on his way home. When the spontaneous search efforts continued for a few more minutes with no results, the Wright family had to confront the terrible possibility that Samuel hadn't simply crawled off somewhere in the yard. After moments of panic and hopelessness, Michael arrived just in time, grasping the situation through his wife's broken recounting and the neighbors' accounts. He immediately made the decision everyone dreaded, calling the police to report a missing child. Michael's call was transferred to the 911 dispatcher, at 4:27 p.m., marking the moment authorities officially received information about a 1-year-old child missing under unclear circumstances. The operator quickly asked the necessary questions. The last time the child was seen, the area of disappearance, any signs of forced entry or violence, and who was home. Upon hearing Michael's description that Samuel vanished in just a few minutes, with no indication the child had crawled out of the yard on his own, the dispatcher immediately determined this was no longer a typical lost child case. The incident code was upgraded to high priority and routed directly to the nearest patrol unit of the Columbus Police Department. 2 patrol cars were dispatched, with an estimated arrival time of under 8 minutes. When the first 2 officers reached the Wright home, they found a group of neighbors fanning out in all directions around the backyard to continue the spontaneous search, while Eleanor stood near the playpen in obvious distress. The officers' first action was to instruct everyone to stop moving within the yard and adjacent areas, as potential evidence could have been disturbed by too many people moving around. They quickly cordoned off the entire backyard, the grass corridor extending to the side path, and about 10 meters from the back fence, out to the edge of the small road where the blue car had reportedly been seen. This boundary was established to prevent any further intrusion into an area that might contain original evidence. One officer spoke with Eleanor and Michael to record accurate information, prioritizing 3 categories of data: the timeline, descriptions of the yard's condition before and after the discovery of the disappearance, and any strangers who had appeared in the area that afternoon. Eleanor provided a relatively clear timeline. Samuel was still in the playpen when she stepped inside for no more than a few minutes. The strange woman had appeared earlier that day, but with no suspicious interaction. The backyard showed no disturbance, except for the toy car tilted over. Michael added information about the green car that a neighbor had reported seeing, though all descriptions remained very general. Meanwhile, the neighbors who had participated in the initial search were asked to stand separately to recount what they had seen in chronological order, ensuring their statements weren't influenced by one another. The police's initial notes determined that Samuel's disappearance occurred in too short a window for a child to have moved far on his own, especially with no signs of stumbling, dropped objects, or crying to indicate his path. The factor of silent disappearance forced the patrol team to consider the possibility of abduction from the very first minutes. One officer quickly checked the yard's access points, noting that the back gate was unlocked and showed signs of having been opened around the time of the disappearance. Though nothing could be concluded yet, this detail was flagged as an increased risk factor. The on-scene response focused on determining the maximum radius a perpetrator could have traveled in the 10-15 minutes since the initial disappearance. If Samuel had been taken from the yard by vehicle, the likelihood that the abductor had left the area immediately was very high. These assessments led the police to elevate the internal alert to possible child abduction status and request additional support units to the scene in preparation for a formal search. Within less than 20 minutes of the 911 call, the Wright home, once a quiet neighborhood spot, had become a focal point for law enforcement, with initial assessment steps carried out continuously to determine the nature of the incident and the next course of action. When additional patrol units arrived, their primary task was to construct a complete and verifiable timeline as the foundation for the entire investigation process. Officers separated each individual, Eleanor, Michael, and the 2 closest witnesses, to record timelines independently and minimize errors from mutual influence. Based on initial statements, police established the first marker at around 4:10 p.m. when Eleanor said she last saw Samuel in the playpen, playing with the wooden car and showing no unusual behavior. The second marker came from a neighbor across the street, who reported seeing a strange woman walking past the front of the Wright house around the same time, then disappearing from view as she headed toward the grass corridor leading to the back. The third marker was when Eleanor stepped inside the house around 4:15 to check the boiling water. At that point, the backyard remained quiet with no unusual sounds. The fourth marker was her return to the yard, determined to be between 4:17 and 4:18 p.m., when Eleanor discovered Samuel was no longer in the playpen. The fifth marker came from another neighbor who reported hearing an engine revving and accelerating from the direction of the small back road around 4:18 or 4:19. From these 5 markers, investigators determined that the window during which the perpetrator could have approached and removed Samuel from the scene lasted only about 2 to 3 minutes, an extremely narrow time frame but not impossible, especially if the perpetrator had been in the area beforehand. After finalizing the timeline, police proceeded to document the scene's condition in detail. The playpen was not tipped over, its netting was not torn, and there were no signs of the child struggling, indicating Samuel had not left the spot on his own initiative. The wooden toy car was flipped to one side in the opposite direction from where Samuel usually sat, which was classified as an abnormally displaced object, and noted in the report. The grass around the playpen showed 2 faint impressions that on-scene officers suspected were adult shoe prints, not too deep due to the dry soil, but distinct enough from a child's foot size. These prints appeared in a path from the grass corridor right up to the edge of the playpen and then back, consistent with a quick approach and quick departure. The back fence was less than 1.5 meters high, with no breaks or scratches, suggesting the perpetrator most likely did not climb over, but passed through the side corridor, where a small gate was usually left unlocked. According to Michael, that gate had remained unlocked since earlier in the day. The area along the back road showed 2 faint tire tracks, but since this was a spot where cars often turned around, police could not draw any firm conclusions. They only noted that the direction of the tire marks could align with reports of a vehicle accelerating away. Another noted detail was the absolute silence during the incident, no crying, no loud impacts, which reinforced the assessment that the perpetrator had operated cleanly and knew how to pick up the child without provoking a reaction. During the scene documentation process, police asked everyone to move back from the yard area for overall photographs, marking of objects, measurements of distances from the playpen to the gate and back road, as well as from the grass corridor to the suspected shoe prints. All data was entered into a scene map for cross-referencing with the established timeline. When combining the 2 elements, the sequence of time and the physical conditions at the scene, the investigative team reached a preliminary conclusion that the crime window occurred between 4:15 and 4:17, when Eleanor was not present in the yard. This gap was assessed as a feasible action window, a term for the period during which the perpetrator had sufficient opportunity to approach, pick up the child, exit the yard through an open path, and enter a waiting vehicle if an accomplice was ready. At a normal walking pace, the perpetrator could have gotten Samuel out of neighbor's sight in under 30 seconds and reached the road edge in under a minute. From there, investigators modeled possible travel based on average vehicle speed if the perpetrator used a car immediately after leaving the yard. Simple calculations showed that within 2-3 minutes after the 4:17 marker, a vehicle could have already left the neighborhood and reached major roads leading to Alabama or into downtown Columbus. The alignment between the timeline and scene conditions strongly inclined the team toward the conclusion that this was not an accident, not a child wandering off on his own, but a deliberate external approach. All collected data was flagged, entered into the case's foundational file, and regarded as the first basis for proceeding with subsequent investigative steps. Immediately after completing the scene documentation and initial timeline construction, the investigative team moved to collecting witness statements from all houses with direct or indirect views of the Wright's backyard. Their goal was to identify any observations occurring between 3:45 and 4:25 p.m., the time frame likely to contain critical signals before and during Samuel's disappearance. Officers divided into 3 groups, knocking on doors in the 2 blocks bordering County Line Road and the small back path, asking each person to recount what they saw or heard without discussing it with other households to prevent statements from being influenced or unintentionally synchronized. The first group of witnesses recorded were those who reported seeing a strange woman in the area before the disappearance. One person living 2 houses away described seeing a woman with dark brown hair walking along the front porch around 4 o'clock, pausing briefly as if observing something in the yard before continuing toward the side grass path. Another witness at the corner of the street confirmed seeing a woman's figure heading in the same direction, though she couldn't recall facial details clearly due to the afternoon sun shining against her. Both statements matched on direction of travel, but not perfectly on timing. The first recalled around 4:05, the second estimated 3:55, 4:10. Police classified these statements as distant visual observations with medium reliability due to timing discrepancies, but consistency in location and direction. The second group of data concerned sightings of someone carrying a child. The most significant statement came from a teenager living in the house behind the Wrights, who reported that a few minutes after 4:15, he saw an adult figure walking through the narrow space between two houses, carrying a small child in their arms. Obscured by the fence and harsh sunlight, he couldn't see the face clearly, only noting it was an adult in a light-colored long-sleeve shirt, moving faster than typical for someone walking with a child. The detail he remembered most was the arms holding the child close to the chest, as if trying to keep it still, and the hurried pace of the steps. The witness did not dare confirm the child was Samuel, but the relative size matched a 1-year-old. This statement was rated by investigators as having relatively high reliability because it aligned precisely with the time frame when Eleanor left the yard and discovered her son missing, and it matched the scene assessment that Samuel was carried away rather than walking on his own. Another witness, gardening in the house directly behind, reported seeing a figure pass quickly along the grass corridor. Unclear if carrying a child, but the appearance occurred around 4:17, 4:18, the key moment in the timeline. This data was classified as supplementary, not detailed enough, but useful for confirming direction of movement. The third group of data involved witnesses who heard a vehicle leaving. A man in the last house on the block reported hearing an unusually accelerating engine around 4:18 or 4:19, like an old sedan flooring the gas to merge onto a main road. His wife, standing near the front door at the time, confirmed hearing a similar sound coming from the small road behind the fence. No witness saw the vehicle directly, but several agreed that the sound stood out from the usual quiet afternoon traffic in the area. Another household farther away reported hearing an engine, but didn't think it was unusual since small trucks sometimes passed around that time. Audio data was categorized as triangulation, used to pinpoint direction and departure timing, not for identification. After collecting all statements, police cross-referenced them with the third part of the timeline. They compiled all data into a time, location, signal type comparison table. The cross-reference results showed one observations of the strange woman mostly fell between 4 o'clock, 4:10 minutes before the disappearance, suggesting the subject may have been scouting or moving around the area prior to acting. Two statements about someone carrying a child fell between 4:16, 4:18, perfectly matching the crime occurrence window identified by investigators. 3. The accelerating vehicle sound appeared immediately afterward, around 4:18, 4:19, consistent with the hypothesis of the perpetrator leaving the area quickly via a waiting or nearby vehicle. The degree of alignment among the three data groups, though not uniform in detail, produced a fairly clear sequence: appearance of strange at approach to backyard carrying child, departure from area by vehicle. The investigative team created a reliability classification table. The carrying child group had the highest reliability due to timeline match and behavior. The hearing vehicle group was rated medium, high due to departure timing match. The strange woman group was medium due to timing variance, but still important for establishing prior presence before the disappearance. After completing the witness statement analysis, police concluded that, although the witnesses' observations were fragmented, when combined they formed a coherent sequence of events, sufficient to establish a rapid approach and rapid departure by an unidentified individual at the moment Samuel vanished. All this data was integrated into the main case file, becoming the foundation to guide the investigative team's next actions. After completing the analysis of witness statements and cross-referencing them with the timeline, the investigative team moved to the step of building primary hypotheses To determine the priority approach, they compiled all the collected data into three main groups: the appearance of an unknown woman before the time of disappearance, the act of carrying the child occurring precisely within the time window from 4:16 to 4:18, and the sound of a vehicle leaving the area just seconds afterward. From this foundation, three investigative hypotheses were established, each representing a different motive and behavioral pattern, helping to narrow the scope and eliminate directions inconsistent with the actual conditions. The first hypothesis was the possibility of an acquaintance with motive. This was a direction that had to be considered early according to standard procedure, as child disappearance cases sometimes involve relatives with conflicts, close friends with impulsive motives, or individuals who had previously interacted with the family. The investigative team began evaluating the factors. The Wright family had no significant financial disputes, no internal conflicts, and no relatives with psychological issues or substance addiction who had caused trouble. Neighbors described the family as living privately, with little interaction with strangers. More importantly, no witness reported seeing a familiar face around the time of the disappearance. The idea of an acquaintance approaching the child in broad daylight in a busy neighborhood without being recognized was highly unlikely. Additionally, the statements about an unknown woman appearing before the disappearance and the signs of quick approach, quick departure ran completely counter to the behavior of an acquaintance who would risk being identified. Based on all these factors, this hypothesis was assessed as low probability and temporarily not prioritized, though it was kept in the file in case new data emerged. The second hypothesis was opportunistic stranger. This direction assumed the perpetrator had no prior plan, but took advantage of the open backyard situation, the playpen placed near the walkway, and the mother looking away for a few minutes. Factors such as the unlocked yard, open side gate, and easy line of sight into the yard from the side road could create an opportunity for a random individual to approach. However, when cross-referenced with the scene data, the completely random hypothesis encountered several contradictions. The unknown woman had appeared about 10-15 minutes earlier, moving in a direction with a direct view of the yard, spotting the exact moment the mother left the yard, and having no obstacles would require an excessively high level of coincidence if this was purely impulsive behavior. Furthermore, the act of quickly carrying the child away and exiting onto the back road within a maximum of 2 minutes showed the perpetrator's ability to assess the situation very rapidly and leave the area decisively, which aligned more with someone who had observed beforehand rather than a passerby acting on impulse. Nevertheless, this hypothesis was still rated as medium probability, as there are cases of opportunistic crimes occurring within such short time windows. The third hypothesis was child replacement kidnapping, also known as child replacement abduction. This is a type of behavior in which the perpetrator, often a woman, selects a random or semi-random child to take and raise as her own, stemming from personal loss, infertility, family breakdown, or psychological instability. When cross-referenced with the behavior described by witnesses, and woman appearing before the disappearance, standing to observe the backyard, moving in a direction allowing direct access to the child, with no signs of struggle or violence, this hypothesis stood out significantly more. The child replacement pattern typically includes observing the target, choosing a moment when the caregiver is distracted, quick approach, carrying the child, and silently leaving the scene to avoid drawing attention. The elements at the scene matched this pattern: no signs of a struggle, the child taken away too quickly for anyone to react, and the sound of a vehicle leaving appearing right after the act. Moreover, the time of day, late afternoon, with sufficient light but people starting to prepare dinner, was also a period this type of perpetrator often chooses because it allows easy blending into the surroundings. When placing all three hypotheses side by side and comparing them to the reality at the scene, the investigative team quickly ruled out the acquaintance with motive direction due to the complete lack of linking elements. The opportunistic stranger direction was retained, but rated lower because of signs of brief preparation before the act. In contrast, The child replacement kidnapping hypothesis showed the strongest match with the observe, approach, depart behavior, especially given the unknown woman's appearance precisely in the lead-up to the disappearance. After this analysis step, the investigative team unanimously agreed that the priority direction for the next phase would be to focus on the unknown female who appeared around the Wright home before the time of disappearance, with the assessment that the perpetrator may have acted according to a specific psychological pattern rather than random impulse. Immediately after establishing the priority hypothesis, law enforcement moved to the next step, organizing a large-scale search within a radius of 1 to 3 miles around the Wright home to determine whether the perpetrator might have left any traces during movement or, in a rare case, if Samuel had been left somewhere near the scene. Early in the evening, the main search team was officially formed with participation from local police, rescue units, neighborhood volunteer support, and a K-9 team trained for missing children searches. The operational area was divided into 3 rings. The first ring was the residential area directly surrounding the Wright home within a 1-mile radius. The second ring extended to the trails connecting to low vegetation areas, and the third ring covered the Chattahoochee riverbank and open lands extending west and southwest. Each ring was assigned to a group with specific tasks, with the sweep expected to take 1 to 2 hours per loop. The K-9 team started from the Wright backyard, having the dogs sniff around the playpen, the grassy corridor, and the side gate to try to find Samuel's movement path or that of the person who carried him. However, the child's scent mixed with the many footprints of neighbors who had passed through during spontaneous searches made tracking very difficult. The K-9 team still attempted to expand the search along plausible routes, along the back grassy path toward the small road where some witnesses heard a vehicle. The dogs paused several times at intersections between the grassy path and dirt tracks leading to the paved road, but there was no consistent enough signal to confirm this as the perpetrator's direction. Meanwhile, the trail sweep group focused on small paths running parallel behind the row of houses, where local pet hunters occasionally passed. They searched for dropped items such as children's clothing, small objects, fabric scraps, or toys, but found nothing. The ground in this area was dry, with a thin layer of leaves insufficient to retain clear footprints, limiting tracking efforts. The second group moved toward a small park about 1.5 miles away. The park had many bushes, wooden benches, and a playground rarely used in the afternoon. This area was considered potentially usable for temporary shelter or hiding something. The sweep was conducted meticulously in a grid pattern, but the result was still no evidence related to Samuel. The rescue team continued to the open land near the Chattahoochee River bank. This was a more complex area due to uneven terrain and many tree-obscured nooks. Searching here required close coordination between humans and working dogs. Officers walked along the riverbank, shining flashlights into dark spots, checking each large rock and dense bush. For a 1-year-old child, if left alone, the chance of leaving survival signs was very small, but the team left no possibility unchecked. However, this area also provided no useful information. No crying sounds, no child slide marks, no personal items. Meanwhile, other officers conducted house-to-house checks within the first ring, asking homeowners to inspect their yards, garages, and unused areas. Some families allowed checks inside storage sheds or outbuildings, but still no results. The search was conducted on the principle of expand outward, then tighten back to the center, meaning extending to 3 miles and then re-sweeping 1 mile to ensure no small details were missed. As darkness fell, the team used high-powered floodlights and flashlights to continue the final loop. The K-9 team was brought back to the starting point to try once more along different directions, but the heavy human presence in the initial hours had completely contaminated the scent trails. The K-9 handlers concluded that if the perpetrator had carried Samuel and entered a vehicle near the back immediately, the dog's chance of picking up the correct trail was very low, especially since the actual movement direction had already been outside the K-9 unit's operational range in the first few minutes. Rescue forces also swept the sparse woods to the west, an infrequently used area with many old trails, but found no related objects. Among the items temporarily collected for checking, all were unrelated dropped items or trash. By the time the groups returned to the assembly point, there were no positive reports. The large-scale search, with more than 3 hours of continuous activity over a wide area, recorded no direct or indirect traces to determine Samuel's location or the perpetrator's confirmed direction of movement. The on-scene summary report indicated that any perpetrator movement after 4:18 was sufficient to escape the searched radius. This reinforced the conclusion that Samuel had been taken out of the immediate vicinity of the Wright home in an extremely short time, and if the perpetrator used a vehicle, the likelihood of leaving the area was near absolute. The search results were entered into the file with the conclusion, no traces. No evidence, no unusual movement detected within 1 3-mile radius. This forced the investigative team to prepare to shift to a broader movement analysis phase and sources of information beyond the neighborhood. Immediately after the 1 3-mile radius search ended without yielding any useful traces, the investigative team shifted focus to the only remaining lead, with potential for identification, the vehicle that several witnesses heard leaving the area right after Samuel disappeared. Although no one clearly saw the license plate or specific identification, statements from 2 witnesses about the color and engine sound provided the foundation for vehicle tracing. Police compiled the data and identified a general description, a light blue or gray-blue mid-size sedan, with an engine sound described as raspy, like an old vehicle or one in poor maintenance. With these characteristics, the team compiled a list of common sedan models in the Georgia area in 1970 with similar color tones, including 3 lines from Ford, Chevrolet, and Plymouth that were prevalent in suburban neighborhoods. The list was sent to the County Vehicle Registration Department to filter all vehicles in the closest blue shades, matching the description. Within a few hours, the registration-filtered list showed more than 60 light blue sedans within a 2-mile radius of the Wright home, and over 100 within 5 miles. The higher-than-expected number forced the team to narrow further by body style, based on the second witness's description of a vehicle with a slightly sloped roof and square rear, a feature matching only a few models from that decade. After narrowing, the list was down to about 32 vehicle owners with matching color and approximate body style. The team divided into small groups and made direct contact with each owner to verify their location during the 4:30 p.m. timeframe on the day of the incident. For each owner, they requested who used the vehicle that afternoon, where it was parked, whether any family member or friend could have borrowed it that day, and the vehicle's travel distance during the key time window. Among the contacted owners, most were at work during the incident and had proof they could not have been near the Wright home. Some vehicles were confirmed by family to have been parked in the garage all afternoon, never leaving the property. Police conducted field checks on these vehicles, comparing tire condition, engine, and model, but none showed signs of use during the suspect time frame. Of the 32 filtered vehicles, only 5 were considered not immediately excludable. 3 involved drivers absent from home for short periods without clear evidence. 1 where the owner did not precisely recall usage time, and 1 belonging to a family living near the backwoods. The team conducted thorough checks on these 5 cases by cross-referencing their daily routes. For the 2 owners who did not recall specific times, police asked neighbors to confirm whether the vehicle was parked at home. Neighboring households stated they did not see the vehicle leave or return during the relevant period. Another owner stated his vehicle was borrowed by his younger brother to go to the store, but the store route was in the opposite direction from the Wright home, and store employees confirmed seeing him during the necessary time frame. This eliminated 3 cases. The remaining 2 cases, 1 a family sedan and 1 a middle-aged man's sedan, were initially assessed as potentially relevant. However, after checking information from relatives, cross-referencing receipts, and confirming workplace presence, both had solid alibis. The middle-aged man's sedan was confirmed parked at the company lot all afternoon, while the other belonged to a family with multiple witnesses, placing them at a birthday party far from the incident area. When conducting broader field checks, including routes the perpetrator might have used to leave the area, no additional witnesses provided matching descriptions. Some people recalled normal vehicle traffic, but none had information sufficient to tie a specific vehicle to the key time window. The team had to consider the possibility that the suspect vehicle might not belong to a nearby resident. The perpetrator's vehicle could have left the neighborhood immediately, and if it belonged to someone from outside the area, local vehicle registration checks would yield no results. The possibility of the perpetrator using temporary plates, borrowing a vehicle from someone not living in the neighborhood, or driving an unregistered vehicle in the area could also not be ruled out. After 3 days of reviewing vehicle data, checking owners, and verifying alibis, the summary report showed no sedan on the list matched the behavior, timing, and location described by witnesses. The vehicle-based investigative direction, despite being the only potential lead pursuable with data, reached a dead end. No matching subject appeared, no suspicious vehicles were detected in the vicinity, and no physical evidence linked any specific vehicle to the scene. The lack of verifiable information forced police to accept that the perpetrator had used the advantage of timing and location to leave the area without leaving identifiable vehicle traces. The final report from the Vehicle Task Group was recorded as insufficient basis to identify any vehicle with direct involvement. Investigative direction, temporarily not feasible. After the vehicle investigation direction in the Columbus area yielded no results, the investigative team shifted to a scenario they had considered early on. The perpetrator may have left the state of Georgia within minutes after taking Samuel. Given that the Wright home was less than 10 minutes by car from the Alabama border, Columbus police immediately contacted law enforcement agencies across the border, including the Phoenix City Police Department and the Lee County Sheriff's Office. The goal was to expand the sweep to gas stations, convenience stores, main routes, and any stop points that might have retained images, payment information, or witnesses who could have encountered an unknown woman carrying a child in the time frame immediately after 4:20 p.m. The Alabama agencies received the information and conducted sweeps of gas stations along Route 280 and connecting side roads. These were locations where the perpetrator might have stopped to refuel, ask directions, or adjust their route. However, due to the very limited security camera systems at the time, many gas stations had only 1 or 2 low-resolution cameras positioned to monitor the payment counter rather than the pump area. When technicians extracted footage from approximately 4:15 to 5 p.m., most videos were blurry, poorly lit, and nearly impossible to analyze for face or license plate identification. A few segments showed light or dark-colored vehicles stopping, but no frame was clear enough to confirm a light blue color or body style matching the witness description. Additionally, no segment recorded an image of a woman carrying a child passing through the store area, rendering the camera data almost unusable. While imagery provided no support, police shifted to transaction data and gas station activity. They requested retail receipts, shift logs, and any remaining transaction records. In 1970, most gas stations used manual recording systems, customers paid cash directly, and attendants quickly noted the amount pumped, approximate time, and pump number. This made cross-referencing difficult because data lacked buyer identifiers and times were estimated rather than electronically clocked. Nevertheless, among the logs, one entry caught attention at a small gas station on the outskirts of Phoenix City. The afternoon shift attendant recorded a vague note: young woman, thin build, light-colored car, paid in a hurry. This note was placed around near 4:30, based on the attendant's memory, not an exact recorded time. When police interviewed the attendant directly, he only recalled that the woman appeared tense, pumped a small amount of gas, paid quickly, and left immediately. However, he did not recall the specific car color, did not see a child, and could not identify the license plate or direction of travel after leaving. Because the description was too vague and not directly linked to features in the Columbus witness statements, the team recorded this only as a Level 3 lead, meaning not strong enough to build a hypothesis or expand investigation in a new direction. At another gas station near Route 280, the attendant provided receipts showing several customers stopping around the suspect time, but when cross-checked with delivery logs, none fit. Most were familiar locals, and the rest were truck drivers whom police could quickly contact to verify locations. At convenience stores along the two-state border, sweeps also yielded no valuable data. Most employees did not recall encountering a strange woman with a child, and if they had, the information was not specific enough to connect to the case. In some stores with shift logs, police tried to trace purchases of baby items or milk, but found no matching receipts in the 4 o'clock, 5 p.m. window. The Alabama sweep extended into the next day, when the team decided to broaden questions to small roadside checkpoints on Route 280 and frequently trafficked areas from Georgia. However, since the disappearance occurred in the late afternoon and cross-border travel between the two states was routine, no one recorded anything unusual. A few people said they saw a light-colored vehicle speeding toward Auburn, but their descriptions were inconsistent and lacked physical evidence for comparison. Alabama police concluded that if the perpetrator's vehicle passed through the area that afternoon, it did not attract enough attention to become reliable identifying data. When all information from Alabama was compiled, the final report noted that although there were a few scattered data points, blurry images, vague shift notes, non-specific statements, no detail reached a usable level for a primary investigative direction. Federal coordination confirmed that if the perpetrator used a vehicle to cross the Georgia-Alabama border, they did so in too short a time frame to leave identifiable traces. After 2 days of work there, the investigative team was forced to conclude no verifiable evidence indicates the perpetrator moved into Alabama, and collected data is insufficient to expand investigation in this direction. After the investigative direction regarding vehicles and the possibility of leaving the state yielded no results, the investigation team turned back to evaluating internal factors, a mandatory step in every missing child case involving young children, to rule out the possibility of motives originating from relatives, acquaintances, or individuals with direct ties to the Wright family. Police began with the nuclear family, Michael and Eleanor. Both individuals' background files were thoroughly reviewed, from financial history, medical reports, employment records, to their closest social relationships. Neither had significant debts, property disputes, criminal records, or risk factors related to domestic violence. Prior to the disappearance, there were no reports from neighbors about arguments, threats, or tension in the Wright household. Investigators interviewed them separately to check the consistency of their statements. The results showed that both accounts matched, their timelines were stable, and there were no signs they were attempting to withhold information. All of this made the likelihood of internal harm virtually non-existent. Next, the investigation team expanded to the extended families on both sides. Parents and siblings of Michael and Eleanor all lived far from Columbus. None were present in the area on the day Samuel disappeared. Their schedules were verified through work records and independent witnesses. No family member had conflicts with the Wright couple or displayed unstable behavior in the past. Police paid particular attention to one case, a cousin who had lived in Columbus a few years earlier, but had since moved away. However, after contact, this individual proved they were in another state at the time of the incident. No relative had a history or motive consistent with child abduction behavior. The investigative direction then shifted to Michael's friends and co-workers. At the machine shop, colleagues confirmed that Michael was on shift during the time of the incident. Many saw him at the production line until near the end of his shift. He was not involved in internal disputes, owed no money to co-workers, and had no conflicts that could lead to retaliation risks. One investigator raised the possibility of someone applying financial pressure or blackmail, but since there were no ransom demands or unusual contacts before or immediately after the disappearance, this possibility was quickly ruled out. Eleanor's close friends were also interviewed. The investigation team was interested in any personal conflicts that might lead to targeting the child, but no one fell into the suspect category. Those who knew her described Eleanor as gentle, with no significant disputes and no reports of harassment from anyone. Some longtime neighbors even said the Wright family lived so privately that it was unlikely they had made enemies with anyone. Another important step was reviewing individuals who had visited the Wright home in the 3 months prior to the incident. Plumbers, delivery personnel, meter readers, all were verified by cross-checking workdates, assigned staff, and their travel ranges. None of them were at the Wright residence area on that day, and employees from those companies all had clear alibis. Police also considered the possibility that acquaintances of the family or past child care helpers might be involved. However, Samuel was only 1 year old and had never been sent to daycare or cared for by outside babysitters beyond family members. This eliminated one common investigative direction, a child care provider acting out due to personal grievances. When combining all the collected information, the investigation team conducted an analysis of motives and risks for each individual. No one in the direct acquaintance group had motivating factors such as jealousy, revenge, financial disputes, or psychological issues. There were no reports of unusual behavior within the family. No one had previously attempted to approach Samuel before the event. Investigators even considered the possibility that a relative had accidentally caused the incident and covered it up, but the scene conditions, the intact playpen, footprints entering and exiting the yard, the extremely short disappearance window, did not fit this scenario. After completing the comprehensive evaluation, the police internal report stated clearly, no individual in the family, acquaintance, or coworker group had the motive, means, or opportunity to carry out a child abduction. Possibility of internal harm ruled out. This result reinforced the investigative direction mentioned earlier, that the case was most likely an approach from an outsider, someone unknown to the Wright family. With the entire close circle ruled out, the investigative force was forced to focus entirely on an unknown perpetrator, the woman who appeared around the Wright home that afternoon, or any individual who may have coordinated with her. Once the entire group of relatives, acquaintances, and direct relationships of the Wright family was ruled out, the local investigative force decided to forward the case file to FBI Atlanta for assessment of severity and assistance in building a behavioral profile of the suspect. Requesting FBI involvement was not standard procedure for every child disappearance case at that time, but Samuel's case had two factors that led Columbus police to classify it as a high-risk abduction: an extremely short time window and the clear appearance of a stranger exhibiting surveillance behavior toward the family prior to the incident. Immediately after receiving the file, behavioral analysis experts at FBI Atlanta reviewed all scene data, witness statements, timelines, and already excluded information. Their preliminary report indicated that the case did not fit patterns of random or impulsive behavior by typical opportunistic offenders. Cases of 1-year-old children being taken without crying, without signs of struggle, and occurring within 2 to 3 minutes typically fell into the category of premeditated offenders or those with specific psychological motives. This reinforced the local police assessment that the perpetrator was unlikely to be male. Based on similar cases from the 1960s, 1970s, the FBI hypothesized that the perpetrator could be a woman, aged approximately 20 to 40, acting independently or with limited assistance from another party. The main reasoning lay in the approach pattern. Women are often less noticed when appearing in residential areas during the day, can approach young children without provoking strong reactions, and can easily avoid raising suspicion among adults in the neighborhood. Witnesses in Columbus also did not describe the appearance of any strange men directly near the time of the disappearance, except for the sound of a vehicle, further increasing the likelihood that the primary perpetrator was female. The FBI's preliminary behavioral profile emphasized 3 additional characteristics: 1. The perpetrator selected the target selectively rather than randomly. 2. There was pre-action surveillance. And 3. Good emotional control in a high-stress situation. Regarding the first, choosing a child in the backyard, where the mother frequently supervised, but with brief moments of inattention, showed the perpetrator had at least basic knowledge of the Wright family's routine. A completely impulsive abduction would be unlikely to achieve such timing precision. Regarding the second, the appearance of the strange woman 10-15 minutes before the disappearance window, standing and observing the porch or yard, indicated scouting behavior. Even if witnesses could not recall the face or specific details clearly, the movement pattern and timing matched the minimal preparation model typical of this type of offender. The FBI noted that child replacement offenders often do not need prolonged observation. Identifying an opportunity within the day is sufficient for action. The third characteristic, behavioral control, was reflected in the absence of crying or unusual noises. A 1-year-old child is very likely to react when picked up by a stranger. The fact that Samuel made no loud sounds may stem from the perpetrator's approach: quick, lift, firm hold and exit from the area within seconds. This behavior requires a certain level of confidence or at least no panic during execution. The FBI viewed this as an indicator that the perpetrator had experience caring for young children or was familiar with handling them. When assessing the pool of individuals fitting the profile, the FBI considered 3 main possibilities: a single woman who wanted a child but could not bear one, a woman experiencing psychological crisis after losing a child, or a woman with cyclical emotional deviant behavior. In 1970, there was no centralized database to screen individuals in the area with histories of miscarriage, child loss or motherhood-related psychological disorders, so the FBI could not narrow the suspect list based on this factor. However, they emphasized that the appearance of a strange woman in a small neighborhood where outsiders rarely walked through was a strong indicator detail. The FBI requested that Columbus police review reports of women exhibiting unusual behavior within 6 months around the time of the disappearance, including information from hospitals, churches, women's groups, or nearby residential areas. Initial review results found no clear matching subjects. No hospitals reported cases of women showing postpartum or miscarriage-related disorders near that time. No local community groups or churches recorded a strange woman appearing regularly in collective activities. Additionally, no residents in Columbus or surrounding areas could identify the vague description provided by witnesses. The lack of viable candidates led the FBI to note that the perpetrator might not be a local resident or may have only been in the area for a very short time, long enough to observe the target and carry out the act. Some similar cases from the same historical period showed that perpetrators sometimes moved between multiple areas without long-term ties to a residence, making identification even more difficult. Although matching the behavioral description, the analysis group could not provide any specific individual for police to pursue. The behavioral profile was finalized in the report. The perpetrator is likely a woman, young adult to middle-aged, with a personal motive related to the need to replace a child or establish a maternal role. The behavior was minimally planned but not entirely impulsive. The action was quick, clean, and careful to avoid leaving traces. The report's conclusion stated clearly: no subject in the Columbus area matches the current behavioral characteristics. Need to expand the search scope to neighboring residential areas or individuals who appeared temporarily in the area prior to the disappearance. Although this conclusion did not provide a specific suspect, it clearly defined the nature of the case: not an accident, not internal harm, not the child wandering away from the yard, but a targeted and intentional abduction. Compiling all data obtained in the first 72 hours showed that the investigation had reached a difficult threshold, with virtually no tangible leads existing long enough to point to a suspect or clear direction. The initial internal report from Columbus Police and the behavioral assessment from FBI Atlanta both identified 3 key reasons why the case entered a state of information scarcity from the very first hours. First was the extremely short crime window. Based on the established timeline, Samuel disappeared within approximately 2 to 3 minutes, a time frame so brief that any approach, lifting of the child, and exit from the area could occur completely without creating noise or drawing attention from those nearby. This period, in the context of a quiet residential area without continuous direct observation, made it entirely realistic for a stranger to act without being spotted. Comparative studies provided by the FBI indicated that in outdoor child abductions, a window under 5 minutes often allows the perpetrator to leave the area without leaving identifying traces. This explained why search efforts in the nearby area were almost ineffective, and why the perpetrator's action trail left no continuous chain of events for police to follow. The second factor was the complete absence of any camera systems in the incident area. In 1970, civilian security cameras were virtually non-existent in suburban neighborhoods like Columbus, and any nearby stores or gas stations with cameras had very low quality. The lack of footage caused police to lose one of the most important tools for determining the perpetrator's travel route, vehicle type, or facial identification of the strange woman. When police expanded the investigation to Alabama, the blurry tapes and limited angles further confirmed that even if the perpetrator passed a gas station or store, the chance of leaving usable identifying images was nearly zero. The absence of cameras made reconstructing the escape route entirely dependent on witness statements, which was the case's greatest weakness. The third factor was the inconsistency in witness statements, something that created serious difficulties for police in accurately determining the exact time, location, and behavior of the suspect. Some witnesses reported seeing the strange woman around 4 o'clock. Others said they saw her earlier or later by a few minutes. The time of hearing the vehicle depart was also not completely uniform, ranging from 4:17 to 4:20. Although these data were sufficient to form a reasonable sequence of actions, the ambiguities in individual statements made establishing an absolutely precise sequence impossible. Additionally, no witness could clearly describe the woman's face or the vehicle's license plate. The lack of specific identifying descriptions rendered all efforts to screen subjects in the area futile, forcing the investigative force to rely on behavioral judgments rather than visual evidence. This inconsistency was not the fault of the witnesses. Most only caught a glimpse of a stranger or heard a vehicle while engaged in other activities, resulting in fragmented memories. However, for a case dependent on minute-by-minute accuracy, such ambiguities severely undermined the investigation team's inferential capability. When these three factors combined, short time window, lack of imagery, and fragmented statements, the case began showing clear signs of a difficult-to-solve disappearance. The 72-hour initial summary report concluded that the chance of locating Samuel within the near vicinity had dropped sharply after the first evening. If the perpetrator left by vehicle, they could have been out of Columbus before police deployed large-scale search forces. Additionally, the lack of witnesses seeing the subject clearly or describing a specific vehicle meant any investigative direction involving identification lacked a foundation for development. Columbus police also assessed that the quiet, low-traffic neighborhood had inadvertently facilitated the perpetrator going unnoticed. This was not an area with complex traffic or crowds, so a stranger's appearance could easily be overlooked under limited afternoon light conditions. Moreover, the perpetrator's behavior, quick approach, quick exit, no noise, demonstrated a high level of intent, consistent with a hard-to-track offender model. When the FBI examined the aggregated data, they classified the case as belonging to the difficult-to-solve cases group, a term for cases with extremely low physical evidence, limited scene access time, and highly controlled criminal behavior. With a 1-year-old child, biological traces were almost non-existent in an outdoor environment, making forensic tracing nearly impossible with the methods available at the time. From a tactical perspective, Columbus police acknowledged that one of the biggest challenges was the lack of direct witnessed reaction. No one saw the moment Samuel was picked up, no one heard cries, and no one noticed anything unusual as it happened. This turned the first 72 hours, the golden period for every child disappearance, into a time filled with assumptions rather than evidence. In the final 72-hour assessment, the investigative force affirmed that the case had shifted to difficult-to-solve status due to the lack of physical traces, lack of suspect identification, lack of supporting imagery, and the high likelihood that the perpetrator left the locality very quickly. All of this created a highly constrained foundation for subsequent investigative steps, forcing police to consider approaches no longer based on direct traces. With the first 72 hours yielding no tangible leads and the official case file classified as difficult to solve, the investigative team was forced to shift to a new search strategy, expanding the radius from 13 miles to 15 miles, covering the entire western border region of Columbus and extending into remote areas where the perpetrator might have paused, switched vehicles, or discarded something during transit. This phase was designated Level 2 Deep Search, aimed at identifying every plausible point a vehicle could have passed through within 10 to 20 minutes after Samuel's disappearance. The investigation team divided the area into three main axes: the urban, industrial axis to the north, the central axis, old parking lots and warehouses, and the federal axis, access points to US 280 highway and its side branches heading toward Alabama. The first axis included the light industrial area located 6 to 8 miles from the Wright home. This zone featured numerous warehouses, small processing shops, material yards, and many secluded corners capable of concealing a vehicle's activity for a short period. Other cases had documented perpetrators stopping in such locations to check on the child, revise plans, or dispose of evidence such as clothing or toys. Search teams began inspecting every vacant warehouse, side entrances to workshops, metal storage containers, and material staging yards. They deployed both K9 units and daylight flashlights to sweep shadow-covered areas. However, the ground in the industrial zone was primarily concrete or gravel, too hard to retain footprints or drag marks. No evidence emerged of anyone stopping a vehicle there in the short time frame following the abduction, and no objects potentially linked to a one-year-old child were found. The investigative team concluded that if the perpetrator had passed through the industrial area, they left no trace. The second axis covered old parking lots and warehouses 7 to 12 miles from the scene. These were large open areas with many unsupervised entry-exit points, ideal for a quick stop without drawing attention. Police combed through parking lots of small commercial strips, old shopping rows, truck stop points, and vacant lots where locals commonly parked overnight. Their goal was to find anomalous tire tracks, children's items, turnaround marks, or any soil or paint samples matching the suspect vehicle description. While inspecting vacant lots, they encountered many overlapping tire tracks, but none aligned in time or terrain characteristics with the area near the Wright home. In 1970, parking lots lacked license plate logging or cameras, making identification of who stopped there that afternoon entirely dependent on nearby residents' memories. When questioned, most neighbors around these lots reported no specific vehicles noticed on the day of the incident. A few recalled normal traffic, but nothing precise enough to connect to the disappearance. No discarded evidence, no drag marks, no signs of anyone entering with a small child. The investigative team noted that this area provided no useful additional data. The third axis was the most critical, the feeder system to US 280. The major route that could allow the perpetrator to leave Columbus and enter deep into Alabama in just minutes. Search teams mapped all possible stop points, minor turnoffs, intersections with side roads, roadside tree clusters, large enough for a vehicle to pull in, and clearings adjacent to the highway. At each site, they checked for tire tracks, footprints, dropped items, milk cartons, baby blankets, or anything of evidentiary value. However, the highway carried far higher traffic density than residential areas, rendering overlapping tire marks inconclusive. Scratches and ruts were too numerous to isolate any specific vehicle's signature. In the most thoroughly searched 5-mile stretch, No object could be linked to Samuel by the team. Some roadside pullouts had litter, but most consisted of food wrappers, cigarette packs, or soda cans, ordinary roadway trash with no relevance. Police also searched trails leading from the main road into low grass or brush, in case the perpetrator walked a short distance to avoid visibility from the highway. But as before, all efforts yielded nothing. No cries, no clothing, no items. After the initial sweep of the entire 15-mile area produced no discoveries, the team decided on a second pass, focusing on key intersections where the suspect vehicle might have paused to change direction. Results remained unchanged. Many officers noted that the flat terrain and vastness of the suburban outskirts made any brief stop virtually invisible once the vehicle departed. After nearly 2 days of expanded deployment, the investigative board compiled reports and reached the inevitable conclusion: no clear movement patterns related to Samuel appeared within the 15-mile radius, and no physical evidence was left behind to guide the investigation. No standout tire tracks, no dropped objects, no discarded purses or baby blankets, absolutely no suggestive leads. The final summary of the expanded search stated: no evidence indicating the perpetrator stopped or followed a specific route within the 15-mile radius. No supporting physical evidence. High likelihood the perpetrator exited the area quickly. This marked a major setback in the investigation, as all direct search avenues reached dead ends and the case began losing its capacity to gather field evidence. When the expanded search yielded no visible traces and on-scene investigative directions hit dead ends, the team shifted to another set of possibilities. The perpetrator may have attempted to legitimize the child's presence by taking the child to a hospital or registering a fictitious birth. This scenario was common in newborn or infant abductions aimed at replacing a lost child, and although Samuel was 1 year old, creating a late medical record or delayed birth certificate remained feasible if the perpetrator acted swiftly and chose loosely regulated facilities. The team began by reviewing records from all hospitals, birthing centers, and obstetric clinics within 20 miles of Columbus, focusing on the 2 weeks following the disappearance. They requested lists of all women seen for pregnancy checks, labor, postpartum care, or birth-related documentation. Major facilities, like Columbus Medical Center and St. Francis Hospital, maintained fairly clear record systems. Birth logs from this period showed no cases involving a 1-year-old or women with suspicious presentations upon registration. All newborns recorded had health check circles consistent with newly delivered infants, with no entries marked as gestational age, unverifiable, or mismatch with reported pregnancy timeline. This quickly cleared the larger medical facilities from suspicion. However, in 1970, many small hospitals or private clinics operated with looser record-keeping. The team continued checking independent clinics and small birthing homes along routes leading out of Columbus. Among these, 2 facilities noted women seeking postpartum consultations without bringing an infant. Upon deeper questioning, staff reported no red flags. One woman claimed a home birth and came for a health check. The other said her child was with relatives. Since these cases involved neither new birth registration nor legal filings, police only documented them without treating them as direct leads. Next, birth registries at the Muskogee County office and neighboring counties were examined. Although most births during this era were hospital-reported, a small number of delayed registrations existed, birth certificates filed months after delivery. This was a point of particular interest, as a late registration of a 1-year-old with unclear origins could signal an attempt to legitimize Samuel. In the 2 months following the abduction, only 3 delayed certificates were filed, all with verifiable family information and witnesses as required by Georgia law. None matched the missing child's description or raised suspicious ambiguities. When the team extended the check to delayed birth registrations in Alabama counties, given the possibility of cross-state movement, results were no better. Records were scattered, declarants were long-time local residents, and no data suggested an unclaimed child. Part of the inefficiency stemmed from the era's paper-based system, which relied heavily on declarant honesty and witness confirmation. If the perpetrator used forged documents, a false identity, or a busier medical facility to legitimize the child, the information might fall outside the search scope. Many small clinics kept incomplete records, and some family-run birthing homes recorded only appointment dates or payment amounts without patient names. Payment record checks revealed only routine transactions, with no entries tied to examining a 1-year-old in the relevant time frame. One investigator noted that even if the perpetrator brought Samuel to a facility, they could have used a false name for the child or presented him as their own biological son. No one at the facility would question a 1-year-old, requiring no immediate documentation verification. This left the medical direction with almost no foothold. After compiling data from hospitals, clinics, birthing centers, and registration offices, the final report stated clearly that no case fit the scenario of the perpetrator legitimizing the abducted child. Investigators also observed that the era's medical facilities lacked synchronized tracking systems, making deliberate use of false documents or misleading information extremely difficult to detect. The report concluded, no medical data or birth registration documents relate to a 1-year-old, matching the victim's characteristics. No evidence the perpetrator took the child to a medical facility immediately after the abduction. The absence of any trace in the medical system further reinforced the assessment that the perpetrator deliberately avoided all official points of contact, acting swiftly and purposefully to leave no administrative footprint. This forced investigators to accept that the hospital and birth registration checks could provide no further information to pursue Samuel's whereabouts. In the years following the exhaustion of hospital, birth registration and expanded search avenues, all yielding no promising signals, Samuel's disappearance gradually shifted from an emergency situation to a prolonged cold case. Each passing year, investigators re-reviewed files at potentially relevant times, such as reports of abandoned children, unidentified minors, or similar incidents within Georgia. However, no case matched Samuel's characteristics or circumstances. Re-examination of witness statements, scene photos, and hospital records only reinforced an early established reality: the perpetrator acted quickly, left no trace, chose the precise moment, and created no opportunity for police to backtrack. The early 1970s brought no new technological tools to aid this type of investigation, no DNA analysis, no public camera systems, and administrative records in many fields still relied primarily on handwritten paper. Columbus police continued monitoring local activities, particularly women showing signs of instability or sudden lifestyle changes, but no individual drew attention or fit the behavioral profile provided by the FBI. No confessions, rumors, or anonymous tips reached police during this period, allowing the case to sink deeper into silence. A series of child disappearance cases in other states were reviewed for similarities, but none shared the same motif or indicators. Any faint hope that emerged was quickly extinguished after cross-checking. No new suspect vehicles surfaced, no new witnesses appeared, and no administrative records aligned. All investigative branches stalled, placing the case in a repetitive loop: review, elimination, waiting, no results. By the mid-1970s, with limited resources, investigators had to reassess the case's priority level. Although Samuel's abduction remained a serious crime, the complete lack of leads over many years led to the decision that the file no longer qualified for active investigation. In 1976, the case was officially closed at the local level and transferred to the GBI Cold Case Unit, the division dedicated to archiving and periodically re-evaluating long-term cases when new information or technology emerged. This decision was not made lightly. Before transfer, the team conducted one final comprehensive review of all remaining physical evidence. However, most initial evidence collected, scene photos, footprint sketches, witness notes, offered no new analytical value, and no biological samples linked to Samuel or the unknown woman existed. After GBI confirmed receipt, Columbus police formally notified the Wright family that the case would no longer be actively investigated but would remain on file and subject to periodic review. For the family, this was a painful turning point. The authorities' suspension of active pursuit effectively ended hope of locating Samuel through traditional means. Eleanor and Michael were told that transfer to cold case status was not an absolute end, but a holding pattern awaiting new data or improved technology. Nevertheless, this did little to lessen the enduring sense of loss and heaviness that stretched across the years before and after. The decision to close the file marked the transition from a phase of intense investigative effort to another phase, one in which Samuel's case would only be reopened upon receipt of new information or the application of newly developed methods in the field of missing persons investigations. After the file on Samuel's disappearance was officially transferred to the GBI Cold Case Unit, the Wright family entered a prolonged period of collapse that no doctor or counselor could effectively intervene in at that time. The authorities' decision to cease active investigation was not merely an administrative procedure. For Eleanor and Michael, it felt like a declaration that the outside world had stopped searching for their son, leaving them trapped in a vortex of intertwined guilt, hope, and despair. From 1976 onward, the Wright family no longer received update calls or requests for information verification from the police as they had in the early years. That silence made the house, already cold since the day Samuel vanished, feel even heavier. Eleanor fell into chronic depression. She slept little, ate little, and always felt numb, as if her body was functioning on autopilot. Michael, though trying to stay composed, was worn down by a sense of helplessness at being unable to protect his family, and especially at being unable to do anything more to find Samuel. He went to work regularly, but carried an obsessive feeling with him. Any child he saw on the street triggered an irrational flash of hope that perhaps Samuel grown up might look like that child. Family meals, already rare, became even scarcer, because every time they sat down at the table, Eleanor would look at the empty chair that had once been placed next to her for Samuel. Neither of them said anything, but the presence of that chair was a cruel reminder that their world had been torn apart forever. Their relationship gradually cracked over time, not because of direct blame, but because each carried a different kind of guilt deep inside. Eleanor believed that if she had not taken her eyes off the yard for a few minutes, it never would have happened. Michael believed that if he had come home just a little earlier, everything would have been different. This self-blame made it hard for them to share their thoughts with each other. They feared that voicing their pain would hurt the other even more. Many couples with missing children broke apart, and the Wrights were luckier in that they remained together, but that togetherness now took the form of two people leaning back against the same wall, enduring the same suffering, but unable to look at each other for too long, for fear of seeing their own pain reflected in the other's eyes. Even though the case was closed, their spontaneous searching never stopped. Michael, after work, often drove aimlessly through farther neighborhoods, sometimes even into Alabama, just to watch children playing in yards and wonder if Samuel might be living in one of those houses under a different name. He always carried a small notebook to jot down places he had been, young faces he had seen, addresses that gave him a vague gut feeling. It was all futile, but the action was how he kept hope alive. Meanwhile, Eleanor searched in a quieter way. She kept all of Samuel's toys in a wooden box, dusting them every month as if they still belonged to a child who hadn't grown up. She also maintained an odd habit. Every now and then she would hang a child's jacket on the clothesline in the front yard, thinking that if Samuel was still out there and happened to pass by the house, he might recognize it as his home. None of the neighbors understood the behavior, but they respected her pain and never mentioned it. The Wrights also considered moving away to escape the memories, but they quickly realized that leaving the place where Samuel disappeared would extinguish the last remaining hope that one day he might find his way back on his own. So they stayed in Columbus, in the very house that caused them pain, but also held the only possibility of leading Samuel home. Every year on the anniversary of his disappearance, Eleanor placed a small candle on the front porch, not to commemorate, for they never believed Samuel was dead, but to mark the time that had passed without finding him. The candle was lit at dusk and left to burn until it went out completely. Michael kept the habit of repairing the back door, the door he regretted not checking thoroughly before leaving the house that year. Every few months he would remove the hinges, file the screws, repaint the surface even though it wasn't damaged, as if trying to fix some invisible mistake he couldn't bear whenever he thought about it. Socially, the Wright family gradually withdrew. They accepted few invitations, stopped participating in community activities, and limited contact with strangers, not because they wanted to isolate themselves, but because they couldn't stand casual questions like "How many children do you have?" or well-meaning consolations that made Eleanor burst into tears in public. Longtime acquaintances still genuinely cared, but they could do little more than occasionally bring food or flowers and leave them at the door. Samuel's story gradually became a shadow in the community. Everyone remembered, but no one dared mention it for fear of reopening the parents' wounds. The Wright family's psychological state grew increasingly fragile without any professional support mechanism at the time. Psychological counseling was not yet widespread, and organizations supporting families of missing children barely existed. Each person had to bear the pain in unsustainable ways, making the late 1970s pass in constant exhaustion. Yet no matter how broken they were, Eleanor and Michael never officially gave up. There was not a single day they didn't think of Samuel. Not a single year they didn't hope that new information would emerge. And it was that desperate persistence that kept them going, even if that life had become nothing more than an indefinite wait. After the file was transferred to cold case and updates from authorities stopped, the Wright family was forced to turn to other sources of support, nonprofit organizations, missing children's search groups, and informal networks that began appearing sporadically from the late 1970s. Though these organizations were still rudimentary and lacked access to official data, they gave Eleanor and Michael the feeling that they were still doing something to find Samuel, that the chance of reunion had not been completely extinguished. The family started by sending Samuel's file to a small organization in Atlanta specializing in collecting information on missing children statewide. The data they provided included the only photo of Samuel taken shortly before he disappeared, descriptions of height and weight, hair color, and the most detailed account they could write of the circumstances. The organization agreed to add Samuel's file to their internal watch list and distributed flyers to some churches and community centers in the area. For Eleanor, just knowing her son's face was appearing somewhere outside Columbus already made her feel less suffocated. But that was only the beginning. In the following years, the Wrights contacted many more organizations, both in Georgia and Alabama. Some were larger in scale, sending periodic newsletters about missing children cases needing attention. Others operated on a semi-spontaneous model, relying on volunteers and small donations. Despite varying levels of professionalism, all were willing to accept Samuel's file. Over time, his photo appeared on wooden bulletin boards in churches, in community warning booklets, and even in a few local radio broadcasts when volunteers asked to mention the case at the end of programs. Michael carefully recorded every place he sent the file to, every response received, and every place that promised to keep the information on file in case of new reports. However, this expansion of the information network also brought unintended consequences. False reports began appearing more and more frequently. Families who saw a strange child in a grocery store would call to say it might be Samuel. A woman in Albany claimed to have seen a boy with a face very similar to the photo and asked an acquaintance to send a letter to Michael. A truck driver reported seeing a woman carrying a brown-haired child near a rest stop on Highway 280 a few months after the disappearance. In the first moments, Eleanor and Michael clung to every one. But each time authorities or they themselves followed up, the answer was the same: not Samuel. These false leads came with frightening frequency. Some months the family received 4 or 5 tips, some months nothing, but just as hope seemed to fade, another vague report would appear, dredging up all the emotions they had tried to lock away in a separate compartment of their minds. Many nonprofit organizations, though well-intentioned, lacked verification processes, leading to the spread of inaccurate information. Some reports came from people genuinely believing they had seen something unusual, others were coincidences or distorted memories. But for Eleanor, every report, no matter how vague, was still a fresh cut into a wound that never closed. She began losing sleep more nights, always wondering, what if this is the right one? What if I ignore it this time? Michael still drove to the reported locations, even though deep down he knew the odds were tiny. He once drove to a city 2 hours from Columbus just to see a completely unrelated child. The shame of misplaced hope followed him for weeks. Gradually, the Wrights realized that continuously receiving false information was wearing them down in an uncontrollable way. From 1978 onward, they limited sending the file to new organizations and only maintained contact with those they trusted. Even so, even the more reputable organizations could do little more than keep the file on their list and wait. There was no centralized database, no facial recognition technology, no federal cross-matching methods. Everything depended on random witnesses and unreliable human memory. By the early 1980s, Eleanor began feeling exhausted every time she opened an envelope stamped from missing children's organizations. She would read every word, carefully fold it back, put it in the box, and not tell Michael right away for fear of raising his hopes again. Both gradually understood that the organizations they had trusted, however well-meaning, could not bring them any closer to Samuel. Hope nourished bit by bit with false information became a new kind of pain, hope that never materialized. And though they never completely abandoned keeping Samuel's file with those organizations, they also understood that this path of spontaneous searching was reaching its limit. Not because they wanted to stop, but because they were exhausted from waiting for signals that never led anywhere. In 1998, nearly 3 decades after Samuel disappeared, his file lay deep in the GBI cold case storage, a file among hundreds of old cases arranged by date and priority level, most never reopened since being transferred there. At that time, GBI was restructuring its storage system, requiring a preliminary review of cases that had not been evaluated in over 10 years. This was the context that brought young investigator Aaron Miller, recently transferred to the cold case unit, into first contact with the Samuel Wright case. Aaron, then just over 30, belonged to the new generation of investigators, those who grew up during the technological transition, with strong cross-data observation skills and particular patience for cases with almost no hope left. During the sorting process, he opened a thin file, the paper yellowed with age, containing only a few crime scene reports, some hand-drawn sketches, 3 black and white photos, and a long series of scattered notes. The name Samuel Wright, Missing Columbus, GA, 1970 appeared right on the first page. At first glance, it was just one of many unresolved child missing persons cases. But when Aaron turned to the initial summary, he immediately noticed the difference. The incident occurred in under 3 minutes, with no physical evidence, no vehicle identification, but with one striking detail, the appearance of an unknown woman right before the disappearance. Most cold case files from that era lack detail, but in Samuel's case, 3 witness statements all mentioned the figure of a woman whose identity was never verified. What particularly caught Aaron's attention was the repetition of this detail across all 3 statements, even though the descriptions did not perfectly match. He read slowly, line by line, underlining sections related to witnesses reporting, seeing the woman walking along the grassy corridor, standing near the fence, and disappearing around the time Eleanor stepped into the house. When comparing these statements with notes from the original investigative team, Aaron noticed that this detail had once been considered central, but had fallen off subsequent investigative directions after a few years due to lack of additional information. In many old-era cases, details deemed undevelopable were often treated as dead ends and gradually deprioritized. But with the behavioral analysis expertise that had developed strongly by the late 1990s, Aaron understood that details once thought useless could be valuable leads if re-examined with new techniques. He paid special attention to a faint pencil note from an investigator of that time. The woman may be the key, unable to identify. That simple note made Aaron pause for quite a while. He continued reading to the FBI Atlanta assessment, which had once provided a suspect behavioral profile, concluding that the perpetrator was likely female, with pre-approach surveillance behavior. This was the detail that made Aaron believe the case had never been properly solved. It didn't fail due to lack of clues, but because the single clue could not be developed with the technology of that era. By 1998, federal databases on women with histories of child abduction, psychiatric records, or specific behaviors across multiple states had begun to integrate, though still rudimentary. This meant that in the near future, rare behavioral patterns could be better cross-referenced, and cases once thought hopeless still had a chance at re-examination. Aaron assessed that Samuel's case fell into that group. After completing the preliminary review, he immediately noted 3 key items on the file cover. 1 detail of unknown woman needs recross-referencing when broader facial recognition databases become available. 2. FBI behavioral profile still relevant should be applied to modern datasets. 3. Case has potential for federalization if signs of interstate movement emerge. These notes did not require immediate reopening of the file, something beyond the authority of a new investigator, but they ensured that Samuel's file would not fall into indefinite storage like so many others. Aaron also flagged the file with a flag for future review tag, a special marker used in the cold case system to indicate that a case had potential for exploitation when later technologies like DNA, population analysis, or identification databases advanced. Before putting the file back into storage, Aaron stood quietly for a moment, looking at the small photo of Samuel, the brown-haired boy sitting on a wooden chair with wide-open eyes, unaware that his life was about to vanish from adult sight in just a few minutes. Unlike many other investigators, Aaron did not see this as a case only to be remembered, not solved. He clearly sensed that this case had a different structure, a key detail confirmed by multiple people but never unraveled, an invisible suspect but with clear behavior, a child who vanished without a trace, yet no evidence he had died. Before closing the file, he added one final line: await new techniques. This is not an unsolvable case, only one whose time has not yet come. And with that small but resolute action, for the first time in over 20 years, the Samuel Wright case had someone who believed it still had a path forward. As the early 2000s began, forensic technology in the United States advanced faster than at any previous period. The CODIS system expanded, DNA analysis procedures became standardized, interstate sample matching was interconnected, and biological identification records began to be stored long-term. For many missing persons cases stretching back to the 1970s, this was the milestone that helped solve a series of files that seemed destined to fade into oblivion. But Samuel Wright's case fell squarely into the gap that technology could not fill. There was no DNA sample from the victim. In 1970, the collection of biological samples from missing children was virtually non-existent. There were no standards for collecting hair, no dental impressions, no reserve blood samples, and the Wright family, like most American families at the time, did not keep any items with biological value, such as hair in a comb, fingernails, or unwashed clothing. When the file was transferred to cold case status in 1976, the very concept of DNA testing had not yet emerged in the field of forensics. Thus, when the GBI updated the file in the late 1990s and early 2000s, the biological evidence section for Samuel was completely blank. This meant that any modern DNA comparison system, whether CODIS, federal, or state, could not be used to locate Samuel. Without an original sample, no profile could be created, and without a profile, no match could be made to anyone identified through national identification programs. This was a severe limitation in a context where many missing persons cases were being solved through DNA comparisons from unidentified remains or abandoned children. Anyone who suspected they might be Samuel, an adult of unknown origin, An individual who recognized irregularities in their own documents could not be verified through DNA techniques without an original sample. This left later investigative efforts by Detective Aaron Miller stuck in a technical dead end. He had enough motivation and knowledge to believe the case could be solved, but he lacked the most basic condition to build a forensic foundation. Aaron had once recommended, in an internal memo in 1998, that if the family still had any of Samuel's belongings, indirect DNA could be collected. But when the GBI contacted Michael and Eleanor, they only had a few toys and scraps of old fabric, all of which had been washed clean and stored for many years. None of the items retained sufficient biological material for analysis, and the technology to extract DNA from trace evidence on washed items was practically impossible at that time. The lab report came back: no viable DNA. The Wright family's disappointment after this conclusion felt like being pulled back to the 1970s, when they had to accept that no one knew where Samuel was. And now, even modern technology could not create a new foothold for them. Meanwhile, the National Forensic Network continued to grow. Many similar missing persons cases were solved, some identified through distant relative DNA matches, some based on civilian databases such as state records, even adoption lists. With each solved case, Aaron felt more acutely the unique helplessness of Samuel's case. It was not failing because of a lack of technology, but failing because the technology had nothing to work with. No sample, no trace, no piece of fabric or item with epithelial cells, no blood from a toy, nothing at all. He described it in a 2001 note as the case is like a dark room with no foothold. No matter how bright the light, nothing is illuminated. In the early 2000s, both the GBI and FBI launched programs to review unidentified victims, cross-referencing missing persons files with previously discovered remains. But in every list, no remains matched Samuel. This could be seen as fortunate, yet it also made clear that this line of verification could not advance any further. Even after being added to the National NamUs database when the system launched, Samuel's file contained only physical descriptions and age progression images. The lack of biological data meant NamUs could not automatically link to any unidentified person records either. The absence of DNA also locked off a potential investigative avenue: kinship analysis with adults who had DNA profiles in criminal or civilian databases. Aaron had considered the possibility that an adult in the future might question their origins and submit DNA to commercial companies. But in 2000, this was still far-fetched. Civilian genetic testing companies were not yet widespread, and their databases were not large enough to create the necessary kinship networks. When all factors were weighed, the GBI reached a clear conclusion: new forensic technology could not move Samuel's case forward until a DNA source from the victim or an immediate relative became available. The Wright family, already exhausted after nearly 30 years of waiting, was once again pushed into impasse. Even the advances they had once pinned hope on, DNA testing, federal cross-referencing, electronic records, could not change the fact that without an original sample, there was nothing to compare. And so, despite the emergence of powerful technology, Samuel Wright's case remained stagnant, trapped within the boundaries left by 1970. The development of CODIS in the late 1990s and early 2000s brought new hope to the entire U.S. forensic field, and for Detective Aaron Miller, it was the first time he saw a door, albeit a very narrow one, that could potentially lead Samuel Wright's case out of the near three-decade stasis. CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System, was built to collect, store, and match DNA from across the states. Initially focused on violent criminals, it later expanded to missing persons and unidentified remains. Although Samuel's case lacked an original DNA sample, Miller clearly understood that CODIS marked a structural shift. An immediate victim DNA sample was not required as long as the system existed and continued to grow. One day, the appearance of a DNA sample from someone related by blood could reignite the case. This was not an unrealistic expectation. Many cold case resolutions later followed exactly this pattern, not through the victim's DNA, but through relatives, even distant ones. Upon reading reports that CODIS was beginning to expand its Missing Persons Index and Relatives of Missing Persons Index, Miller immediately recognized that the Wright family, though exhausted, could still provide DNA data for future storage. He drafted an internal memo proposing that Samuel's file be placed in a awaiting possible DNA match category, a special status for cases without victim DNA but with potential to be activated as technology or population data expanded. This was not standard procedure in the GBI at the time. Typical cold case systems only flagged files with evidence awaiting analysis, not those with no sample at all, but Miller was determined to make it happen. He argued that this file was distinct in three ways. The victim disappeared at a very young age. Survival in a different environment was entirely plausible, and the suspect's behavioral profile aligned with later patterns, often linked to nurturing abductions, cases where victims could grow up unaware they had been kidnapped. More importantly, the relative's DNA index could be stored long-term without needing victim DNA. CO disallowed this. After discussions with cold case unit leadership, Miller contacted the Wright family. Convincing them to provide DNA was not easy, not because they objected, but because they did not want to nurture false hope. Eleanor was nearing 70 in frail health, her pain still as raw as in 1970. Michael, though cautious, understood most clearly that a slim chance was better than none. Ultimately, both agreed to provide blood samples. The samples were sent to the GBI lab, split into two portions. One kept in internal records, the other entered into CODIS as DNA reference for missing persons, a category for immediate relatives. When the report confirmed their DNA had been entered into the system, Miller felt for the first time that the case had a foothold. Not now, but at some point in the future, if an adult appeared with DNA matching a parent-child relationship, the system would automatically flag it. He noted on the file cover, awaiting possible DNA match through relatives index. This was not just a line of text, it was a reminder sent into the future of the investigative field that this case was not dead. The advent of CODIS also helped Miller understand something crucial. Each year thousands of DNA samples were added, not just from criminals, but from missing persons, unidentified individuals, and even relatives of long-standing cases. This meant the likelihood of a relevant sample for Samuel would increase year by year, like a cumulative effect. He described this in a 2002 note. "We don't need to find Samuel now. Just let the system find him." Miller began building a long-term strategy for the case. Not through a full-scale reinvestigation, but by keeping the file alive in the system, ensuring it never drifted into a forgotten corner. He updated old notes, digitized key documents, and made sure every detail about the unknown woman, the only behaviorally weighty element, was converted into parameters suitable for post-2000 analysis. A key part of his strategy was keeping the file in a ready state, because he believed the combination of CODIS, civilian DNA, and federal data integration would gradually create the right environment to solve the case. One entry in his work log from that time read clearly, "We are in the foundation building phase, not the answer finding phase." The emergence of CODIS also marked the point when the GBI and FBI began viewing unsolved child abductions with unknown whereabouts as cases solvable through indirect methods, kinship matching and biological data, rather than relying solely on evidence lost to time. Miller understood that as long as Samuel's file remained in awaiting DNA match status, the chance of uncovering the truth would persist, perhaps not today, but when technology grew strong enough. Labeling it awaiting possible DNA match did not reopen the file, but it kept the case alive in a way the 1970s could not, positioning Samuel to seize the DNA explosion of the early 2000s. While the file was quietly held in the system with that fragile hope, elsewhere in Georgia, an important piece of the truth was silently taking shape. In the late 1970s, as the name Samuel Wright gradually faded from the press and the investigation file fell into silence, more than 100 miles southeast of Columbus, in the city of Macon, a boy suddenly appeared in the small community along Emory Highway under a new name, Evan Hayes. No one knew where he came from, why his vaccination record started later than other children's, and no one questioned why Linda Hayes, a woman living alone in an old wooden house, became the mother of a roughly 1-year-old child, despite never having been pregnant or adopting through any official process. She offered a vague explanation that the child was a distant relative sent to her due to family difficulties. But that explanation was given only once and never repeated. The locals, accustomed to simple lives, did not probe further. And so, Evan Hayes grew up in a closed circle, fully under Linda's near absolute control. Evan's childhood lacked neither food nor clothing, but it lacked what a child needs most: freedom to grow and interact with the outside world. Linda cared for him with meticulousness that bordered on inexplicable. She never let Evan play in the yard when strangers passed by, never allowed him to go to crowded places, and almost never permitted him to sleep over at friends' houses. Every step Evan took was watched by Linda's constantly tense eyes, as if the slightest lapse could bring disaster. When Evan started kindergarten, the control became even more evident. Linda always stood near the school gate, arriving nearly an hour early to observe the children coming and going. She avoided talking to other parents, declined all invitations to join group activities, and instructed the school to allow no one but her to pick Evan up, even in emergencies. Many teachers noticed Evan was gentle and obedient, but there was something hesitant in his interactions. He never asked about where he came from, never talked about family, never mentioned relatives. When asked to draw your house, he drew only a brown house with closed windows and 2 figures, a small child and a woman standing somewhat apart, almost detached. However, with no signs of abuse, the school could not intervene. Linda was overprotective, but at that time, that alone was not enough to raise an alarm. As Evan entered elementary school, the differences in his lifestyle became clearer. Children around Emory Highway were often allowed by their parents to ride bikes along the street, play ball in front yards, or buy candy at the small shop near the main road, but Evan was not permitted to leave Linda's sight. Even on the rare occasions she allowed him to play in the backyard, she stood by the kitchen door watching. Any unexpected noise from a neighbor would startle her into pulling Evan inside. This vigilance could be seen as unusual, but Evan grew so accustomed to it that he believed it was normal in every family. He only recognized the difference as he grew older and saw his friends had far more freedom. By age 10, Evan began asking questions. Why didn't he have a birth certificate like his classmates? Why did Linda always answer for him about his age and birthday at doctor's visits? When submitting high school enrollment paperwork, the identity verification process made Linda increasingly tense. She submitted a photocopied birth certificate with faint ink stamps and information that did not match Evan's earlier medical records. The registrar asked questions, but Linda quickly explained that she had lost the original and had to request a replacement. At that time, lax verification procedures and no federal data linkage allowed the file to be accepted without further checks. But it was Evan himself who noticed the inconsistency on the birth certificate. His place of birth was listed as a hospital in Savannah, a place he was certain Linda had never mentioned. He asked, but Linda evaded the answer, insisting that there are things you don't need to know, and everything in the past doesn't matter. The way she said it, quickly, sharply, as if fearing some door in Evan's mind might open, made him fall silent. But it could not dispel the growing unease. Beyond the strict control, there was another thing that always made Evan feel he did not truly belong. Linda almost never hugged him. She cared for him fully, but maintained a clear emotional distance. When he was sick, she worried to the point of near panic, yet still kept her hands at her sides, placing medicine and water on the table instead of comforting him like other mothers. She seemed more like a guardian than a mother. A part of Evan, though he could not yet articulate it, always felt their bond was something patched together, not naturally existing. When Evan was 13, a small event shook his entire perception. While cleaning the storage area, Evan found an old wooden box in the bottom drawer of Linda's wardrobe. Inside was nothing special, just a few bank papers, a faded baby cloth, and a small wooden comb. But what struck him as odd was a small slip of paper with a nearly faded pencil note. C. 1970. He brought the box to the living room to ask Linda, and her reaction was stranger than the object itself. She snatched the box so quickly it scratched his hand, then snapped. "This is not something you're allowed to touch." After that night, the box disappeared. Evan never saw it again. Though he did not understand the meaning of the note, he understood it connected to something Linda did not want mentioned. During his high school years, the suspicion in Evan was no longer fleeting, but became a quiet, lingering truth. His identity had a problem. He tried to check his personal records at school, but the documents provided were always copies. He never once saw an original. When he asked Linda's relatives, the few she still kept in touch with, they all said they had never known her to have a biological child. No one recalled her adopting. Each told a different story, and those differences created a large gap Evan did not know how to fill. Throughout high school, Evan continued living under Linda's tight control. She severely limited his extracurricular activities, opposed him going out at night, and always sought to know his schedule hour by hour. He was never allowed to leave Macon unless accompanied by her. Small requests, like going to camp, sleeping at a friend's house, or even getting a part-time job, provoked strong reactions from Linda, as if everything risked taking him away from her. To outsiders, Linda was just a solitary, slightly eccentric woman, but to Evan, she was an insurmountable wall. And the older he grew, the clearer he felt that wall was not only holding him in, but also hiding something. Something related to a name he had never heard. Samuel Wright. A name he did not yet know at the time, but one that carried a timeline eerily matching the faded note in the wooden box Linda had hidden forever. Evan's simmering doubts about his own identity began to turn into concrete signs when he turned 15, the age when many administrative procedures required students to submit copies of their birth certificates, vaccination records, and basic identification documents. During a records check at the school office, as the secretary flipped through Evan's file, he accidentally caught a glimpse of the first 3 pages, which were almost entirely blank. The columns for basic vaccinations, DTP, polio, MMR, were all marked with the same vaccination date, and that date coincided with when Evan was about 2.5 years old. While his classmates had vaccination entries spread out from infancy, his record only started from that single point. When Evan directly asked the secretary why his record was different, she simply replied that the local doctor updated it late and handed the file back without much thought. But to Evan, the anomaly was too obvious to ignore. Back home, he brought it up with Linda. She answered immediately, a little faster than usual, "When you were little, your medical records got lost. I had to take you to get vaccinated again." The way she said it made Evan not dare to press further, but in his mind, the story didn't hold up. A 2-year-old child who hadn't received any shots at all? It didn't match anything he'd ever heard. That doubt grew thicker when he started re-examining his birth certificate, a document he'd previously only glanced at without paying attention. The paper was kept by Linda in a locked drawer, but once when he asked her to retrieve it for an extracurricular activity form, Evan looked long enough to notice the ambiguities. The issuance date of the birth certificate was more than 2 years after the recorded date of birth. The handwriting for the hospital name differed from the handwriting for the mother's name. The stamp from the Vital Records office was smudged and crooked. When Evan pointed out these irregularities, Linda immediately became tense, saying that a lot of birth certificates from back then were like that, and snatched the paper back so quickly that it wrinkled. A small action, but enough to signal to Evan that he shouldn't bring it up again. But the harder he tried to stop himself from asking, the greater his unease grew. Other kids in class brought baby photos as requested by the teacher for the My First Year's project, but Evan had none. Linda said, the photos had been damaged by moisture, but Evan had never seen a photo box, an album, or even a single family photo of her and him as a baby. There was no trace in the house of a child's presence before the time he began to have memories. No birthday albums, no greeting cards, no keepsakes. Even the child health record book that most of his friends had, even if it was just simple notes from the doctor, Evan had never seen. He asked Linda if she kept any items from when he was little, and she only said, "I'm not good at keeping old things." A normal-sounding statement, but one that completely contradicted her personality. The woman who saved every receipt from years ago, who never threw anything away if it could still be used, who treated every household item as if it held special value. So why were only the things related to Evan's early childhood completely missing? As Evan grew older and became familiar with the school computers, he tried checking his records by asking the family doctor for a medical copy. This doctor, who had been seeing Evan since elementary school, said that Evan's file only began at age 3. There was no data transferred to the clinic from before that. This was illogical. Children from birth to 3 years old were required to have vaccination schedules and regular checkups. The doctor also found it strange, but since Linda had explained the paperwork issue as due to moving from somewhere else, he didn't raise further questions. Evan understood clearly that the emptiness wasn't due to loss, but because it never existed in the first place. As the high school years passed, the feeling of not belonging to any system, no complete medical records, no baby photos, no relatives, became a constant obsession for Evan. Every parent-teacher meeting made him feel out of place when he heard friends talk about uncles, aunts, and grandparents. He had never met anyone from the Hayes family except Linda, and the people she called relatives were so unfamiliar that Evan suspected she only chose those who could help legitimize her story. Once, at a late summer party at the home of one of Linda's distant relatives, Evan overheard them talking in the kitchen. Someone asked Linda, "When did you adopt this kid? I remember you didn't have any plans like that before." Linda replied too quickly, "Oh, it's been a long time. Who remembers clearly?" But the man frowned. "I remember back then you said you didn't know anyone with small children." That remark made Linda's face change visibly. She ended the conversation immediately and pulled Evan out to the backyard under the pretext of helping Mom carry things. To Evan, that memory became an important piece, even though at the time he didn't understand the full picture. In his junior year social history class, the teacher assigned an essay on family origin. This was when Evan realized he had no information to write about. When he tried asking Linda about his father or paternal relatives, she answered firmly, "It's not relevant to you." When Evan asked about his actual birthplace, she said that everything changed after we moved. But she never specified where he had moved from or in what year. That unusual evasiveness made Evan determined to examine the birth certificate more closely. One night while Linda was asleep, Evan secretly opened the cabinet where she kept documents and found a copy of the birth certificate. This time he observed carefully. The mother's name section had slightly shaky handwriting, while the birthplace section was bolder and neater. The dates showed signs of overwriting, as if corrected on a typewriter before reprinting. The strangest thing was that the area code belonged to a small district about 70 miles from Savannah, a place that didn't appear in any of Linda's stories about her past life. When he cross-checked this information with national forms, which Evan found through the school library, he realized that the code didn't match any licensed hospital in 1970. It was the code of a temporary office that had ceased operations years earlier. This discovery made Evan understand that his birth certificate wasn't just unusual, it was invalid. No baby photos, no standard vaccination records, no relatives, no trace of existence before age 2, a contradictory birth certificate, and what was even more frightening was that every question Evan asked seemed to lead to the same wall. Linda Hayes. To him, this was no longer a vague feeling. His identity had a serious problem. But he still couldn't imagine the true extent of the truth, that his life hadn't just been hidden, but had been severed from a family that had been waiting in Columbus for nearly 20 years. Linda Hayes began to decline noticeably toward the end of the year when Evan turned 19. The persistent coughing, shortness of breath, and mornings when she lacked the strength to get out of bed forced Evan to quit his part-time job to stay home and care for her. Linda had never allowed anyone to help, even as her condition worsened. Evan realized she was fighting something, not just the illness, but the things she had hidden for so many years. In her final weeks, Linda often called Evan's name in the middle of the night, as if she feared he would disappear, echoing the fear she herself had imposed on his life since he was small. Then one winter evening, when the pain left Linda barely conscious, she signaled that she wanted to talk. Evan sat down beside the bed, taking her frail hand. Linda looked at him for a long time, her eyes holding an anxiety she could no longer hide. And then she said what Evan had sensed for years, "You're not my biological child." Evan remained silent, but his heart felt crushed. Linda continued in halting words, "Didn't give birth to you. You came to me under circumstances I couldn't talk about back then." She mentioned no other names, no real mother or real father, only the vague statement, "I was wrong, but I couldn't lose you." Tears ran down Linda's cheeks. For the first time, Evan saw her cry over something unrelated to her usual worries. She gripped his hand tightly, so weakly it was almost trembling. "I can't explain everything, but you need to know, you don't belong here." Evan asked again, his voice shaking. "Then where did I come from?" Linda shook her head, struggling to breathe. I can't tell anyone, or why. You just need to know that you have real parents. They never gave up on you. Never." That final sentence, "they never gave up on you," hit Evan hard. It didn't sound like the confession of someone selfishly guilty. It sounded like the admission of someone who had lived for years in fear that the truth would take him away from her. Evan asked several more times, but Linda only repeated one near unconscious phrase, "I kept you safe. I was afraid they would find out. I was afraid you would leave." What chilled Evan wasn't the content of her words, but the word they. Not your parents, not someone, but they. As if a group of people were involved in separating him from his birth family. Before Evan could ask more, Linda began coughing violently and was taken to the hospital. She passed away 3 days later, leaving no further explanation. No notes, no names, no clues. Only one last sentence Evan heard as she clung to his hand before closing her eyes. "Don't let what happened stop you from finding the truth." After the funeral, Evan returned to the house where he had lived his entire life, and the fragile sense of truth followed him like a shadow. Every room bore traces of Linda, her control, her anxiety, and the silence that had lasted nearly 20 years. But it held no trace of him before age 2. No old wooden box, no original documents, nothing belonging to a boy named Samuel. Evan began searching every drawer, every storage bin, every notebook Linda kept. Many pages had been torn out. Many documents had clipped corners or altered handwriting. In an old financial ledger, Evan found 2 scraps of paper that left him stunned for a long time. One was a gas station receipt near the Georgia-Alabama border, dated to the period Linda had described as the year I got you. The other was a 1971 bank slip describing a cash payment from an unclear source. Neither document mentioned an adoption, because clearly there had been no such procedure. Everything pointed to a truth far larger than a child sent by distant relatives. The more Evan searched, the more gaps he found. Any information related to his origins had been erased, hidden, or replaced. Throughout Evan's life, the things Linda forbade him to ask all led back to the same point. He wasn't just a child without clear parents, he was a child severed from his true identity. After Linda's death, the control vanished, but the truth began to emerge more clearly than ever. Evan stood in the quiet house, feeling the emptiness around him like a long streak, with no starting point. And it was at that moment he understood that the journey to find his true origins had begun. No one to stop him, no one to shield him, and no one to misexplain. Just him, and the simple but weighty question, if Linda Hayes wasn't his biological mother, then who was his real mother? And why did he carry a name that didn't belong to him? After Linda passed away, leaving a void larger than anything Evan had ever imagined, tracing his true origins became an urgent need, rather than the vague suspicion of previous years. He started with the simplest but most fundamental step, checking birth records at the Georgia Department of Public Health. With the dubious birth certificate Linda had given him earlier, Evan took a copy to the Department of Public Health office in Macon. The clerk looked at the paper for a few seconds and immediately noticed the irregularities. It was printed in a format no longer used after 1975. The stamp was tilted out of the required position, and the area code didn't match any hospital or vital records office in the archived lists. When Evan asked them to search for the original record corresponding to the registration number on the paper, the clerk checked the system for a few minutes and returned with a short but spine-chilling answer. "There is no record on file." Evan asked them to check under name variations, Hayes, Evan S., even trying the birth date Linda had reported. The system still returned blank. No birth record under the name Evan Hayes, no birth record matching the date on the paper, no record of any mother named Linda Hayes, registering a birth in Savannah or anywhere else that year. This wasn't just unusual. It meant Evan's documented identity had no legal validity. A name not in Georgia's birth database, a name that didn't exist in state records. The clerk, recognizing the seriousness, suggested Evan file a request for identity verification investigation. Evan agreed, filled out the form, and provided the copy of the birth certificate, school records, guardian information, and current circumstances. Per procedure, this information would be forwarded to the appropriate agency if there were signs of document fraud or misidentification. Evan didn't know that this request, when routed through federal and state systems, had triggered a completely parallel process and led to the cold case unit. Cases involving invalid documents, especially adults with no birth records found, were forwarded to the GBI to check for possible links to historical child abductions. When Evan's data file was entered, the system didn't produce a specific match, but one detail caused it to be flagged. Evan's estimated birth year, 1970, matched an unsolved missing child case. Because Samuel's file had been tagged awaiting possible DNA match, and included a note from investigator Aaron Miller that the victim might still be alive and using another identity. Evan's new file was automatically sent to the cold case unit for manual review. That was when the file landed in Aaron's hands. When he opened it, he saw the initial information name Evan Hayes, no birth record, invalid birth certificate, no evidence of existence in the first 2 years of life. He flipped through the summary and read the details: no baby photos, no vaccination records before age 2. Parental identity unverified. These descriptions almost verbatim repeated the characteristics he had written in Samuel's file notes years earlier. If the victim is still alive, the perpetrator is highly likely to have created a new identity with a fake birth certificate. Vaccination records will not match. No baby photos. No relatives. Aaron's heart beat faster as he compared Evan's estimated birth year, recorded as 1970 due to no other verifiable evidence, with Samuel's disappearance year, also 1970. It could have been coincidence, but when he read further to a small report from the health department, indicators suggest the birth certificate may have been created using a 1971 template at a now-defunct Vital Records office. A template that perfectly matched his own analysis of paperwork in child abductions from the 1960s, 1970s. The coincidence became too perfect to dismiss. The most crucial part appeared at the end of the file. The individual reports that the guardian admitted she is not the biological mother. This was the key piece the Samuel case had never had. An unofficial adoptive woman, not through legal channels, hiding the true identity and tightly controlling the child into adulthood, a pattern that perfectly fit the behavioral profile the FBI had outlined in 1970. To Aaron, every signal pointed to one conclusion: Evan Hayes could be Samuel Wright. He placed the two files side by side, one of the child missing in 1970, one of an adult with no history before age 2, and saw that the gaps in this file matched exactly the gaps in the other. Nearly 30 years earlier, investigators had seen the appearance of the strange woman as an important clue, but had no way to develop it. Now, the existence of Evan Hayes was the first time they had a clear direction, an adult with an illegal identity, born the same year as the disappearance, raised under the control of a single woman, with no record of giving birth, with altered documents and information wiped clean before age 2. The final report, Aaron wrote at the top of the file, contained only 4 words, potential full match. He knew this wasn't proof, but it was the strongest lead the Samuel case had ever had, and for the first time in 3 decades, the name Samuel Wright was no longer lying dormant in a file cabinet. Evan agreed to provide a DNA sample on a morning in April 2003 after receiving a call from the GBI informing him that verifying his identity relates to a long-standing archived case. Evan had no idea that the person waiting for the results more eagerly than anyone else was investigator Aaron Miller, the one who had followed every unusual detail in his file since the day it was transferred to the cold case unit. The sample collection process was straightforward. A buccal swab, a small blood sample, 2 sealed envelopes with signed confirmations. But for Evan, every mark on those envelopes felt as heavy as if they held the answers to an entire life he had never understood. For Aaron, this was not just the DNA of an individual needing identity verification. It could be the final piece to solve a case that had haunted the GBI for 33 years. When the samples reached the forensic lab, the comparison process was carried out by directly matching against the DNA of Michael and Eleanor Wright, 2 samples that had been entered into CODIS in 1999 at Aaron's suggestion. Although Samuel had gone missing at a very young age, parent-child kinship matching remained fully accurate, with near absolute reliability. All that was needed was to wait for processing and analysis time. While waiting, Evan went through long, tense days. He didn't know what he was about to face. Part of him hoped the doubts about his identity were just a misunderstanding, that maybe Linda had hidden something, but nothing too serious. But a deeper, more honest part knew the truth wouldn't be that simple, because his life had never had a real foundation. He looked back on the years living under Linda's control, the gaps in paperwork, the stories she dodged, and realized the DNA results could change everything. Aaron, meanwhile, tracked the testing progress every day. He couldn't intervene in the technical process, but he had access to sample status and the notes from the responsible technician. Preliminary results appeared after nearly 2 weeks. A short line, but enough to make his heart tighten. High likelihood of biological relationship. Full analysis pending. That very note prompted him to immediately recheck Samuel's entire file, every detail, every hypothesis, every piece he had pieced together over the years. Everything fit: the year of disappearance, the age, the gaps in vaccination records, the falsified birth certificate, Linda's deathbed words, the Macon location, all reconnected into a chillingly logical chain. 3 days later, the official report landed on Aaron's desk. He held it in both hands, feeling it weigh many times more than usual. On the second page, under parentage analysis, the final conclusion appeared. Probability of biological parentage match 99.998%. Evan Hayes is the biological child of Michael and Eleanor Wright. No further evidence was needed. No additional steps required. The results were crystal clear. Evan Hayes was Samuel Wright, the child who vanished in 1970. The child the entire state of Georgia had desperately searched for. The child who had left the Wright family waiting for over 3 decades. Aaron set the report down, closed his eyes for a few seconds to steady himself. For 33 years, no one knew whether Samuel was alive or dead. No one knew he had grown up in a house just over an hour's drive away. No one knew that the strange woman from back then had lived an ordinary life so unremarkable that no one suspected her connection to a child abduction. And now, the truth was no longer in old files, it resided in undeniable, irrefutable genetic code. The GBI reopened the case the very day the results came in. An emergency meeting was convened, attended by representatives from the Cold Case Unit, Forensics, and the GBI Atlanta office. Aaron presented the entire process leading to the DNA conclusion. From the anomalies in Evan's file, to the link with the Samuel Wright case, and finally the forensic analysis. No one in the room objected. DNA numbers never lie. The decision to reopen the file, something the Wright family had once hoped for, but no longer dared to expect, was signed immediately. But a far more difficult task lay ahead. Notifying Evan that he not only had his true identity, but also a real family. A family that had waited for him for 33 years, and simultaneously notifying Michael and Eleanor Wright that their son, the baby carried away in just a few fateful minutes, was still alive. The DNA report was sealed and sent to the GBI director's office, labeled Urgent, Parental Notification Required. As for Evan, he was invited to the investigative office to discuss identity analysis results. He sat in the small meeting room, unaware that in just a few minutes, the entire history of his life would be completely overturned. Evan didn't know that out in the hallway, Aaron was holding the report in his hand, feeling the weight of the truth the boy was about to receive. A truth that was both liberating and shattering. A truth that would bring Evan back to the life of a child named Samuel, the child he never remembered, yet who had never truly ceased to exist. When the door opened and Aaron stepped in, his gaze carried seriousness, compassion, and something Evan had never seen in any investigator before, the relief of someone who had finally broken a decades-long obsession. On the table, the DNA report was placed down. Aaron spoke slowly but firmly. "Evan, we have found your true identity." And in that moment, the moment when two timelines separated for 33 years finally converged, a cold case officially moved into a new chapter. As soon as the DNA results confirmed Evan was Samuel Wright, the GBI's next step was to backward investigate the entire life of Linda Hayes, the woman who had raised Samuel for over 3 decades. Since Linda was deceased, all information had to be traced through administrative trails, old documents, labor records, tax filings, residence addresses, vehicle records, and any living witnesses who might remember her. The goal was to answer 3 questions. Who was Linda before becoming Evan's guardian? Had she ever lived in or appeared near Columbus in 1970? And most importantly, how had she brought Samuel to Macon? The review began with payroll and federal tax records. Files showed Linda Hayes first appeared in tax data in 1972. With an address in Macon, working part-time at a small sewing workshop. But when investigators dug deeper into the previous address section, it was left blank. This was unusual, as most tax forms required filers to list their prior year residence. The omission suggested Linda may have moved to Macon without leaving a trail. The GBI continued tracing rental records. A 1972 lease agreement was signed under the name Linda Hayes, but it lacked a social security number, a rare but possible occurrence if the landlord didn't require documentation. When speaking with the former landlord, now 84 years old, investigators noted his account. She moved in alone. No relatives, not much luggage, but a few months later, there was a child around 2 years old with her. The landlord didn't recall the exact date, but clearly remembered that the child's appearance came without any clear explanation. This was the first detail suggesting Samuel was brought to Macon shortly after the abduction. The GBI next searched vehicle records. A 1965 Ford Fairlane was registered under Linda's name in 1971, also in Macon. Investigators checked whether Linda owned any vehicle in 1970. After days of effort, a faded document was finally located in the Randolph County Traffic Archive. A 1969 parking violation ticket issued in Columbus to L. Hayes. No specific address was listed, but the signature closely matched samples of Linda's later signatures. This discovery immediately drew the team's attention. It didn't prove Linda lived in Columbus, but it proved she had been there at least once, within a time frame not far from Samuel's abduction. The GBI expanded the search further. An outdated personnel file from a cashew processing plant in Columbus showed a temporary employee named Linda H., hired for 3 weeks in the summer of 1970. The record lacked a full last name due to seasonal labor, but the date of birth and physical description matched Linda Hayes almost perfectly. Brown hair, about 5'4" tall, small build. The manager at the time, now 93, and with fading memory, still provided one key detail: a young woman worked a few weeks, then disappeared without notice. He didn't recall her name, but remembered she was quiet, a bit awkward, but paid close attention to the other workers' children. Standing alone, this detail might mean nothing. But in the context of Samuel's file, it became a critically important lead. Linda was in Columbus during the summer of 1970, the exact time of Samuel's abduction. The GBI's next task was to reconstruct Linda's travel timeline. Through scattered pay stubs, old bank statements, and surviving bills, an initial picture emerged. In 1969, Linda lived near the Georgia-Alabama border, moving frequently between small towns. In 1970, she appeared briefly in Columbus. By 1971, she vanished from all records and only reappeared in 1972 as a Macon resident. During the critical gap between 1970 and 1972, the GBI found no tax records, rental agreements, hospital files, or airline/rail/bus documents under Linda Hayes's name. It was as if she had completely disappeared from the system for those 2 years, perfectly consistent with the behavior of someone who had just committed a child abduction. Additionally, another clue surfaced when the GBI reviewed Macon labor records. A woman named Marjorie Kemp, who worked with Linda in 1973, recalled that Linda said she didn't want to go back west because of trouble with some people there. The woman didn't remember the details clearly, but the story made investigators think of the child-stealing replacement pattern the FBI had noted in 1970. Behavioral profiles, informal or quasi-religious groups of women who appeared sporadically in the South and Southwest U.S. at the time. The investigation shifted to old vehicle paperwork. From DMV records, the GBI discovered Linda had registered auto insurance with an address in Phoenix City, Alabama, in late 1970. This address was less than 20 minutes from the area where Samuel was abducted. No record showed she lived there long-term, but this milestone allowed investigators to sketch a temporary route: Columbus, Phoenix City, Macon. Everything aligned terrifyingly with the possibility that Linda had taken Samuel out of Columbus immediately after picking him up. When all the pieces were placed together, the picture became clearer than ever. Linda was in Columbus the year of the crime. Her residency records vanished precisely during Samuel's abduction period. She reappeared in Macon with a child lacking a valid birth certificate. She created a new identity with falsified documents, and throughout her life she maintained an extremely tight pattern of control, precisely matching the 1970 witness descriptions of the strange woman seen around the Wright home before Samuel disappeared. The GBI concluded that Linda was not only possibly the woman who approached Samuel that day, she was very likely the sole perpetrator. The official investigation moved into reconstructing Linda's 1970 movements, aiming to determine exactly how she transported Samuel and whether anyone else was involved. And for the first time since 1970, the question who carried Samuel away from the Wright's yard had a serious evidence-based answer more solid than ever. When all historical data, archived records, and final administrative traces were finally pieced into a seamless chain, the GBI reached its official conclusion. Linda Hayes was the sole possible perpetrator of Samuel Wright's 1970 abduction, and all indirect evidence and behavioral patterns pointed to her with no reasonable alternative. From her appearance in Columbus during the same summer as the crime, to the nearly 2-year gap in all records, to the sudden emergence of an unidentified child in Macon, everything aligned with the behavior of a lone individual committing abduction to fill a maternal role, exactly as outlined in the FBI's 1970 behavioral profile. The 1970 witnesses described a young, small-framed woman observed around the Wright yard. This description matched strikingly with Linda's youthful appearance in the 1970 Columbus employment records. No other individual in the area or in records from that period fit the physical description, timing of appearance, and pre-crime surveillance behavior. Deeper investigation into Linda's finances and movements showed no indication she ever connected with any criminal group, extremist religious organization, or child trafficking network. This reinforced the assessment that she acted alone, driven by personal emotional motives rather than an organized criminal plan. Behavioral analysts also confirmed that the extreme control Linda exerted over Evan for the following 3 decades, restricting social contact, close monitoring, avoiding medical and administrative systems, was a classic pattern of child abduction for replacement perpetrators, often seen in women who had suffered trauma or child loss earlier. Although Linda's hospital records showed no evidence of childbirth or miscarriage, the lack of records from 1968, 1971 suggested she may have experienced a personal event without documentation. When cross-referenced with the 2003 DNA results confirming Evan was Samuel, the GBI concluded that Linda was not merely an unlawful guardian, but the perpetrator who carried Samuel from the Wright's yard in a 2 to 3 minute window in 1970. The only remaining open question was, did she act entirely alone, or did someone assist with preparation or transportation? The investigative file noted 2 possibilities. First, Linda may have received help from a friend or relative in moving from Columbus to Phoenix City before taking Samuel to Macon. Second, she may have temporarily stayed with someone during the traceless period. However, after reviewing Linda's entire social network from 1965 to 1990, the GBI found no individual showing any sign of involvement, nor anyone ever suspected or reported under any circumstance. Those who knew Linda described her as reclusive, with little family contact, no long-term relationships, and no close friends. This made the likelihood of an accomplice very low. But because Linda was deceased, investigators could not take direct statements or verify personal information, so any possibility of assistance, if it existed, could not be further confirmed. The GBI's official conclusion, signed at the end of 2003, stated clearly, based on available evidence and forensic confirmation, Linda Hayes is identified as the sole offender responsible for the abduction of Samuel Wright on June 12, 1970. No additional offenders can be confirmed. Legally, since Linda died before the case was reopened, no prosecution was possible, and the case was closed with the status solved, offender deceased, a designation used specifically for cold cases where the perpetrator is deceased, and no further criminal actions can be investigated. In the case summary meeting, a GBI representative stated that although the perpetrator could not be brought to justice, identifying Evan's true identity, now known as Samuel, and clarifying Linda Hayes's criminal actions held great significance not only for law enforcement but also for the Wright family, who had lived more than 30 years in pain, not knowing their son's fate. The investigative file also noted that Linda Hayes showed no signs of continued dangerous behavior after the abduction. She did not repeat the act, did not seek additional children, and engaged in no other clear criminal activity. This reinforced the conclusion that the abduction of Samuel was a singular, impulsive act within a specific psychological context that could not be fully reconstructed due to missing historical information. The investigation report ended with a summarizing observation. Although the specific motive of the subject remains speculative, evidence gathered over more than 30 years indicates the primary purpose was possession and raising the child as her own, with no signs of abuse toward the victim during upbringing. When the official file was closed, a long era of silence, deadlock, and pain finally came to an end. But with the conclusion, solved, offender deceased, the Samuel Wright case entered a new chapter, not the story of a missing child, but the story of a man's reemergence, bearing 2 identities, 2 lives, and a truth finally confirmed by DNA after more than 30 years. The reunion was arranged on a late autumn afternoon, when the golden light spread across the lawn in front of the GBI headquarters in Atlanta. A moment that was both peaceful and so heavy that Samuel felt his chest tighten as if it were about to burst. He didn't know what to expect. A few weeks earlier, when he was informed that he was the biological son of Michael and Eleanor Wright, the feeling wasn't immediate joy, but a shock so profound that he couldn't put it into words. Nearly 33 years of living as Evan Hayes had built a thick shell around him, and now Samuel, the name that had belonged to him since birth, was suddenly returned to him, along with the two people who had searched for him their entire lives. On the other side, Michael and Eleanor sat side by side in the small private waiting room that had been prepared. Michael gripped his wife's hand tightly, feeling as though he were reliving the chaos of that day in 1970 when their son vanished from the front yard in just a few minutes. Eleanor couldn't even speak. All morning she had repeated one sentence in her head: "He's alive, our son is alive." She had waited for this moment for so long that when it actually arrived, she trembled as if stepping into a fragile dream that could shatter at any second. When the investigator brought Samuel to the hallway outside the room, he paused. Taylor, the investigator accompanying him, said quietly, "You don't have to rush. Just breathe first." Samuel nodded, but his hands were still trembling slightly. He didn't know who he was about to meet. He didn't know what they expected. He didn't know if he could fill the 33-year gap, but he knew he had to step into that room. When the door opened, Eleanor was the first to see him. She stood up abruptly, so quickly that the chair behind her tilted slightly. Samuel stopped right at the threshold. No one spoke for the first few seconds, seconds that felt almost endless. Eleanor's eyes locked onto his face, every feature, every small movement. She brought both hands to her mouth and burst into tears as she could no longer hold her breath. Michael stood up more slowly, but his hands clenched so hard that his knuckles turned white. Samuel took one step into the room. It was the moment all three of them instinctively felt they were connected in a way that needed no DNA test to confirm. Eleanor's eyes were red and swollen, but she struggled to catch her breath enough to speak one word: Samuel. No one had spoken that name to him in over 3 decades. Yet when it rang out, Samuel felt clearly that the name truly belonged to him. It fit the voids he had carried, fit the questions he had never dared to ask, fit the vague sense of something missing that he could never name. He replied, in a slightly choked voice, "Yes, it's me, son." Eleanor stepped closer, then stopped before touching him, as if she feared he would vanish if she moved too quickly. She asked in a trembling voice, "Can Mom hug you?" Samuel nodded. All three of them broke into tears as Eleanor wrapped her arms tightly around him, an embrace she had held in her heart for over 30 years, an embrace Samuel had never received from the woman who raised him. Her hands trembled on his back, gentle yet terrified that he would disappear from her arms a second time. Michael stood beside them, covering his face with one hand to hide his reddened eyes. When he stepped forward, he placed a hand on Samuel's shoulder, slowly but firmly. He said in a hoarse voice, Dad never thought he'd get to see you again." Samuel couldn't respond right away. He just nodded, letting his father's hand rest on his shoulder for a few more seconds. A small gesture that carried 3 decades of longing. After the three of them sat down, the initial wave of emotion began to shift into a slight awkwardness. The distance of so many years couldn't vanish instantly. Samuel didn't know where to start. Michael didn't want to probe too deeply. Eleanor wanted to hold him forever, but was also afraid of making him uncomfortable. That fragility created an atmosphere that was both warm and cautious. Aaron and Taylor stood in the corner of the room to observe, ensuring privacy while remaining ready to assist if the emotions became overwhelming for anyone. Samuel was the one to break the silence first. I'm sorry I didn't know anything about you two. I don't have any memories." Eleanor shook her head immediately. "No, you don't have to apologize. You didn't do anything wrong," Michael added. "We're just grateful you're alive. That's enough." Those words made Samuel bow his head, trying to swallow the lump rising in his throat. All his life, he had felt something missing that he couldn't name. And now, that feeling was being filled by the two people sitting in front of him, two people who didn't blame him, didn't demand that he remember a past he had never known. The conversation continued with careful questions. Michael asked about his life in Macon, but avoided going too deep into Linda so as not to hurt Samuel. Samuel shared the basics: a sheltered childhood, school, recent part-time jobs. Eleanor listened to every word, sometimes gripping Michael's hand to stay calm at the thought that their son had lived an entirely separate life. Samuel also asked questions, though hesitantly. He asked about the day he disappeared, about the family back then, about the things that had belonged to him before he was taken. Each answer from Michael and Eleanor became a piece of the puzzle he had never had. The picture of his real life, his true life, began to emerge through his parents' own words. When Eleanor took out a small photo she always carried in her wallet, a picture of Samuel at 1 year old, he stared at it for a long time. Not because he remembered anything, but because the photo carried a strangely familiar feeling, as if he were looking at a part of his past that Linda could never erase. He lightly touched the edge of the photo with his finger, unable to believe he was looking at himself, the version that had never been returned to him before. The reunion lasted for hours. The more they talked, the more the initial reserve melted away. Among the three of them, there was no demand to fill the 33-year gap immediately. Only acknowledgement, empathy, and presence. Those were enough for Samuel to feel that he was stepping into a part of his life that truly belonged to him. The part that had been stolen from him long ago. When the meeting ended, Eleanor hugged him again. This time she whispered, "You don't have to love us right away. Just know that we have loved you for 33 years and never stopped." Samuel closed his eyes, letting the emotions rise once more. He didn't know what his new life would be like, didn't know how he would bond with the Wright family, but he knew one thing for certain: he was no longer someone who belonged nowhere. The reunion after 33 years didn't erase the pain, couldn't return the lost childhood, but it brought two things that both he and his biological parents had lacked for 3 decades: the truth and a return. And in that moment, for the first time in his life, Samuel felt he had been placed exactly where he belonged. In the weeks following the reunion, Samuel entered what experts call the post-reunion identity reorientation phase, a period filled with both hope and deep upheaval. He no longer lived fully as Evan Hayes, but he hadn't yet fully become Samuel Wright in his own mind. The two names clashed in every everyday moment, when filling out forms, when introducing himself to strangers, when looking in the mirror each morning. The truth had been confirmed by DNA, by his parents' memories, by the investigation files, but identity cannot switch in a single day. At first, Samuel thought finding his biological family would immediately fill the void he had felt his entire life. But reality was far more complex. He felt caught between two worlds. Gratitude toward Linda, even though she was the one who kidnapped him. She was also the one who raised him, and the longing to be close to Michael and Eleanor, the people who had lived in agony for 33 years because they lost him. Sleepless nights began to appear more frequently. Questions drilled deep into his mind. Who am I? Who do I belong to? Should I feel grief for Linda? Am I betraying her if I get closer to my biological parents? Samuel's psyche didn't collapse, but it swayed strongly. The GBI, aware of the complexity of post-reunion adjustment in long-term missing persons cases, connected Samuel and his family with a team of psychologists specializing in family reunification after prolonged separation. Dr. Lawrence, a therapist experienced in this field, became the most important bridge. In the first sessions, she explained, "You don't have to choose one family to be loyal to. You have two histories, and both are real." That statement helped Samuel release some of the self-imposed pressure. Meanwhile, the Wright family also had to adjust their lives. Michael and Eleanor had aged a great deal. They were now in their 60s, with hearts full of both joy and fear. Samuel's return made them happy, but it also forced them to face the reality that he had lived an entire life without them. Eleanor sometimes said things that made her cry immediately afterward. Mom doesn't know what you like to eat. Mom wasn't there when you had your first fever. Mom never heard your first words. Michael was quieter, but the pain was clear when he looked at Samuel for too long without speaking. His presence was a miracle, but also a reminder of everything life had taken from them. To help them adapt, the psychologists organized family therapy sessions in which all three had to learn how to build an entirely new relationship, one not based on shared memories, but on mutual acceptance in the present moment. In those therapy sessions, Samuel was encouraged to share his true feelings, and the first thing he said made Eleanor burst into tears. "I don't know how to be your son, but I want to learn." From the other side, Michael also shared his hidden fear. "Dad is afraid you feel like a stranger. Dad is afraid we're asking too much of you." Those honest moments became the foundation for their new relationship. The local community also played an important role. Many religious organizations, veterans unions, and support groups for families of missing persons in Columbus sent encouraging letters. Some families who had experienced a disappearance but never reunited also wrote to share, saying that Samuel was their living hope, that his story helped them believe that sometimes the impossible can still happen. That support made the Wright family feel they were no longer facing the truth alone. As for Samuel, he began visiting Columbus more often. At first the visits were awkward, but gradually they became more comfortable. Family dinners, looking through old albums, listening to Michael talk about his youth, listening to Eleanor describe the days when Samuel was learning to walk. He remembered nothing, but those stories helped him see his life before 1970 as a film pieced together from his parents' memories. There were times Samuel felt guilty for not immediately feeling the deep attachment they hoped for, but the experts reminded him that attachment doesn't come from blood, it comes from time, and time was what they were beginning to rebuild. One of the most important steps in restructuring the family was the meeting with extended relatives. The people who had once held him as a newborn, the people who had spent 3 decades holding annual memorials for Samuel, all cried when they saw him. But instead of forcing closeness, they were guided to keep a gentle approach, letting Samuel set the pace of contact. Surprisingly, Samuel, who had lived an entirely different life, felt comfortable in the presence of the unconditional warmth from this family. Gradually, he realized that a part inside him was returning to its rightful home, even if he had to relearn how to step inside from the beginning. During this time, Samuel also had to deal with the conflicts surrounding Linda Hayes. Though she was the one who kidnapped him, Samuel couldn't deny that she had raised him, cared for him, and in her own distorted way, loved him. The psychologist helped him understand that feeling pity for Linda did not contradict recognizing her as the perpetrator. Those were two truths that could coexist. Accepting both helped Samuel move forward without being trapped in guilt. The family restructuring process unfolded step by step, at a pace comfortable for all three. They began creating new memories, Thanksgiving dinners together, visiting the Wright grandparents' graves, watching Samuel smile as he viewed old Wright family videos he had never seen before. Those simple moments marked the formation of a new bond, not replacing the past, but carrying them forward. And though Samuel still carried 2 names, 2 histories, 2 lives, he began to understand that from now on, he didn't have to choose one. He could carry both, and still move forward as a whole person. The post-reunion period was not an ending, but the beginning of a new family structure, built not on shared memories, but on the willingness to heal the losses that time had caused. Even though the case was officially closed and Samuel returned to his biological family, there were still gaps that left the investigators, psychologists, and even Samuel himself unable to feel completely at ease. The first and biggest question was the appearance of the mysterious man that one witness had mentioned on the morning of 1970, the man standing far from the Wright's fence, as if observing everything but not directly involved. The GBI reviewed resident records, employment records, and data on people passing through the area at that time, but never identified this man. He might have been just a passerby, who happened to be there at the right moment. Or he could have been someone with Linda, an accomplice who assisted her in the preparation or relocation phase after the abduction. Linda's brief appearance in the Columbus area, combined with signs of movement through Phoenix City, meant the hypothesis of a temporary accomplice could not be completely ruled out. However, there was no record, evidence, or testimony strong enough to confirm his role, leaving this detail forever in the shadows of the investigation. The second mystery, and the question that tormented the Wright family for years, was why Linda chose Samuel. There was no indication that Linda had known the Wright family beforehand. No conflict, no connection, no personal motive. Behavioral analysts suggested Linda may have selected her victim based on opportunity. A child frequently playing in the yard, in a quiet neighborhood where adults sometimes let their guard down for very short periods. But there was also the possibility that Linda's motive stemmed from her own unresolved trauma, not recorded in hospital files, such as losing a child, multiple miscarriages, or having custody rights taken away under unclear circumstances. The way she controlled Samuel throughout his upbringing, from medical records and vaccination schedules to severely restricting social interaction, reflected a pathological fear of losing a child. However, since Linda never shared her past and key years of her life remained blank in records, the question why Samuel still had no definitive answer. The third mystery emerged during the reconstruction of Linda's journey. Did she carry out the abduction alone, or was she connected to other missing child cases in the area at that time? The GBI reviewed cases of young children who vanished within a 100-mile radius of Columbus from 1968 to 1972. Looking for patterns matching Linda's crime style, no body found, no physical evidence, and the appearance of a strange woman around the time of the incident. The results showed 2 other missing cases with similar characteristics, but not enough traces to conclude Linda's involvement. No DNA, no direct witnesses, no documents. Only a similarity in pattern, which in criminal investigation can be coincidence or could be missing pieces of a larger picture. Finally, the mystery that weighed most heavily on Samuel's mind was a deeply personal question: did Linda ever regret it? Her dying words, though vague, suggested she believed she had protected Samuel from them. But who were they? A group? A family? Was the fear inside Linda real, or just her way of justifying her actions? Samuel would never know. There were no diaries, no letters, no one who heard her tell the full story. What belonged to Linda ended in fragments. A woman who lived in isolation, controlled her adopted son to an extreme degree, and carried a fear that was never explained. The investigators concluded that the case was resolved legally and technically, but on a human level, shadows remained that could not be fully illuminated. The mysterious man outside the fence, Linda's true motive, and the possibility of other related disappearances all became parts that history could not answer. And in Samuel's mind, those ambiguities didn't just belong to the case, they belonged to his own life. The years cut off from his biological family, the memories that could never be recovered, and the questions that would never have complete answers. The story of Samuel Wright, a child who disappeared in 1970 and was found after 33 years through DNA technology, is not just a journey of reuniting with family, but also reflects many existing issues in American life today. From the blind spots of the system back then, such as low priority for child missing persons reports, fragmented federal-state investigations, and lax community oversight, everything showed the risks that modern society still faces. Today, although the U.S. has Amber Alert, widespread security cameras, digitized and interconnected records, child replacement abductions like Linda Hayes' case still occur, cases where the perpetrator seeks not violence, but possession and raising the child. Samuel, growing up under extreme control, without valid documents, without vaccination records, without relatives, is a reminder that warning signs are sometimes right in front of our eyes, but easily overlooked, both in communities and in the system. From this story, the practical lesson for American society today is vigilance is not just fear, it is protection. Observing unusual signs, like a child lacking medical records, overly controlling guardians, vague paperwork, is not about judging, but about sounding the alarm in time. DNA technology, as seen in Samuel's own journey, underscores the importance of families with missing loved ones proactively storing relative DNA samples, a recommendation from organizations like the NCMEC in the U.S. that not everyone follows. And finally, the Wright family's story is a reminder that hope can be the strongest force for sustaining justice. They never held a memorial service, never declared Samuel dead. This kept the case from being classified as hopeless. In American life today, when the system is sometimes overwhelmed and faith in justice is tested, Samuel's story reminds us that persistence, preserving evidence, community connection, and belief in scientific progress can all change one person's fate. If you believe that stories that seem hopeless can still find light, please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next journeys of justice. Thank you for joining us, and see you in the next video, where we continue to explore truths uncovered through time.